There are stories that lurk in the shadows, tales so eerie, so unexplainable, that they blur the line between reality and nightmare. Tonight, we dive into some of the most chilling true stories ever recorded. Mysterious disappearances, haunted houses, and unsolved horrors that have baffled even the sharpest minds. Are you ready to step into the unknown? Turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and let the darkness take hold. Ghost town of Centralia, Pennsylvania. The year is 1970. 8 years had passed since the earth in Centralia, Pennsylvania, had first coughed up its fiery secret. 8 years since the whispers began, carried on the sulfurous breath of the mine fire that raged beneath the town. 8 years since the exodus, leaving behind a ghost town draped in a perpetual twilight of smoke and ash. My name is Thomas, and I was a rookie firefighter with the Ashland Hose Company. We were tasked with monitoring the situation in Centralia, a grim duty that mostly involved checking for flare-ups on the surface and measuring the ever-present acrid fumes that seeped from the cracks scarring the roads. Most of the older guys treated it like a chore, a grim necessity. But for me, there was a disquieting fascination with the place. It was as if the town itself was a wounded beast, still breathing, still smoldering with resentment. The official line was that the fire was a coal seam fire, ignited by some unknown means, and virtually impossible to extinguish. They talked about sealing off sections of the mine, pumping in inert gases, all sorts of technical jargon. But the fire just kept burning, a stubborn, subterranean demon. My first visit to Centralia was on a crisp autumn day. The air had a strange, metallic tang to it, and the sky was a hazy gray, even though the sun was shining brightly elsewhere. The town itself was a chilling tableau. Houses stood empty, their windows like vacant eyes staring out onto deserted streets. Storefronts, once bustling with life, were now boarded up, their faded signs hinting at a forgotten prosperity. A thick layer of ash coated everything, muting the colors and giving the town a ghostly pallor. We drove down the main street, the tires crunching on the gravel and ash. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the crackle of the radio and the low rumble of the fire deep beneath our feet. Even then, you could feel the heat radiating from the ground in places, a subtle but persistent reminder of the inferno below. Our task that day was to check a series of monitoring wells located near the edge of town. These wells were essentially pipes sunk into the ground, allowing us to measure the temperature and gas levels. As we went from well to well, the older firefighters, guys like Sal and Frank, would grumble about the inconvenience, about the wasted time. They treated Centralia like a dead thing, a place to be avoided, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was anything but dead. It felt watchful, as if the empty houses were eyes, following our every move, as if the ash itself was whispering secrets we couldn't quite hear. At the last well on our list, something happened that I still can't fully explain. It was near the old cemetery, a place that seemed to exude an even deeper sense of melancholy than the rest of the town. The well itself was located in a small clearing, surrounded by overgrown weeds and crumbling tombstones. As I was taking the readings, I noticed a wisp of smoke rising from a crack in the ground nearby. It wasn't unusual. Smoke vents were common throughout Centralia, but this one was different. It was a thin, almost ethereal wisp, and it seemed to be swirling and dancing in the air. I pointed it out to Sal, who shrugged dismissively. "Just another vent," he said. "Don't worry about it." But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something unnatural about it. As I watched, the wisp of smoke seemed to take on a shape, a vague, human-like form. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, but the shape remained, flickering in the smoky air. Then, I heard it, a whisper carried on the wind, seemingly coming from the smoke itself. It was faint, barely audible, but I could have sworn I heard it. It sounded like a woman's voice, soft and mournful, calling a name I couldn't quite make out. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked at Sal and Frank, but they were busy talking, oblivious to what I had seen and heard. I wanted to say something, to tell them what I experienced, but I was afraid they would laugh at me, dismiss me as a naive rookie. So, I kept quiet. I finished taking the readings, and we left Centralia as the sun began to set, casting long, eerie shadows across the deserted streets. But the image of the swirling smoke, the sound of the whispered name, stayed with me. I knew, deep down, that I had witnessed something that day, something that defied explanation, something that hinted at a darkness lurking beneath the ash and smoke, a darkness that had taken root in the ghost town of Centralia. The drive back to the firehouse was quiet. I sat in the back of the truck, staring out the window at the passing landscape, but my mind was still back in Centralia, replaying the image of the swirling smoke and the whispered name. I tried to rationalize what I had seen, to come up with some logical explanation. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, a combination of smoke and shadows playing on my eyes. Maybe the whisper was just the wind, playing through the trees and abandoned buildings. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something different about Centralia, something that went beyond the physical devastation. It was a feeling, a sense of unease that settled in your bones the moment you crossed the town line. It was the feeling of being watched, of being judged. Back at the firehouse, I tried to shake off the experience, to focus on the mundane tasks of cleaning the equipment and preparing for the next shift. But the image of the smoke, the sound of the whisper, kept creeping back into my thoughts. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned in my bed, my mind racing with images of Centralia. I saw the empty houses, the cracked streets, the plumes of smoke rising from the ground. I heard the whispers, growing louder and more distinct, calling out the same name over and over again. Finally, I gave up on trying to sleep. I got out of bed and went to the living room, where I flipped through the channels on the TV, hoping to find something to distract me. But even the flickering images on the screen couldn't drown out the whispers in my head. I decided to do some research. I went to the local library and started looking up articles and books about Centralia. I wanted to know more about the town, about its history, about the fire. I was hoping to find some explanation for what I had experienced, some way to make sense of the unsettling feeling that had taken root inside me. I learned that Centralia had once been a thriving coal mining town, a close-knit community of hardworking families. But the fire had changed everything. It had not only destroyed the town physically, but had also ripped apart the community, scattering its residents to the winds. I read about the early days of the fire, the attempts to extinguish it, the gradual realization that it was unstoppable. I read about the exodus, the stories of families forced to abandon their homes, leaving behind everything they had ever known. And then, I came across something that made my blood run cold. A brief mention in an old newspaper article, a story about a series of strange occurrences in the years leading up to the fire. Whispers in the wind, unexplained noises, sightings of shadowy figures. The article even mentioned a local legend about a woman who had died in a fire in the early 1900s, her spirit said to be trapped in the town, forever searching for her lost child. The name the woman called out in the legend was similar to the whisper I had heard in the cemetery. It wasn't an exact match, but it was close enough to send a shiver down my spine. I closed the book, my hands trembling. I didn't know what to believe. Was it possible that the whispers I had heard were connected to the legend? Was it possible that the fire had awakened something ancient, something malevolent? I left the library that night with more questions than answers. The unsettling feeling in my gut had intensified, replaced by a growing sense of dread. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that my experience in Centralia was not just a random event. It was a sign, a warning. Something was happening in that ghost town, something that was far more sinister than a simple coal fire. Over the next few weeks, I continued to monitor the situation in Centralia, but my visits were different now. I no longer saw it as just a job. I felt drawn to the town, compelled to uncover its secrets. I started spending more time there, exploring the abandoned buildings, Walking through the deserted streets, listening to the whispers in the wind, I began to notice other strange things. Objects moving on their own in the abandoned houses, flickering lights in the windows, even though the power was long since cut off. The distinct smell of smoke, even when there were no visible vents nearby. One afternoon, while exploring the old elementary school, I found a child's drawing tucked away in a dusty classroom. It was a picture of a house engulfed in flames, with a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. Underneath the drawing, a child had scrawled a single word, "Help." The drawing sent a chill down my spine. It was as if the children of Centralia, even in their memories, were trying to warn us, to tell us what was happening. They knew something terrible, and their fear echoed through the abandoned halls. The drawing of the burning house became a chilling reminder of the unseen presence in Centralia. It was more than just a drawing. It felt like a message, a cry for help from the past. I started to feel a responsibility, a strange compulsion to understand what the children had sensed, what secrets the town held. I continued my research, delving deeper into the history of Centralia. I discovered that the area had a long and troubled past, even before the coal mining boom. Local legends spoke of ancient burial grounds, of Native American tribes who believed the land was cursed. They spoke of spirits trapped between worlds, restless souls seeking peace. I learned that the fire wasn't the first tragedy to befall Centralia. There had been mine accidents, industrial disasters, even a devastating flu epidemic in the early 1900s. The town seemed to be a magnet for misfortune, a place where tragedy clung to the very air. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that the fire had not only ravaged the town physically, but had also torn a hole in the fabric of reality, weakening the veil between the living and the dead. I started to suspect that the whispers I was hearing were not just echoes of the past, but warnings from the present, from entities trapped within the fiery depths of the earth. My visits to Centralia became more frequent, more focused. I started carrying a small tape recorder with me, hoping to capture some of the strange sounds I was hearing. I explored the abandoned houses, the crumbling churches, the overgrown cemetery. I even ventured into the mine itself, as far as I dared. The oppressive heat and the choking fumes a constant reminder of the inferno raging below. One particularly chilling afternoon, I was exploring the old church on the outskirts of town. It was a small, dilapidated building, its stained glass windows shattered, its pews covered in dust and debris. The air inside was heavy, thick with a sense of sadness and decay. As I walked through the church, I noticed a small, wooden box tucked away in a corner. It was old and worn, its lid covered in intricate carvings. I hesitated for a moment, unsure whether I should open it, but the feeling of compulsion was too strong to resist. I lifted the lid of the box, and a wave of cold air washed over me. Inside, I found a collection of old photographs, letters, and personal belongings. They seemed to belong to different people, different families. There was a faded portrait of a young woman, a lock of hair tied with a ribbon, a child's toy, a worn Bible. As I looked through the contents of the box, I felt a strange connection to the people who had once owned these items. I felt their sadness, their fear, their desperation. It was as if their emotions were imprinted on the objects, lingering in the air. Suddenly, I heard a noise, a soft, rustling sound coming from the back of the church. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I listened intently, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. The rustling continued, growing louder, closer. It sounded like someone moving through the church, shuffling their feet on the dusty floor. I slowly turned around, my eyes scanning the shadows. I could see nothing, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I felt a coldness in the air, a presence that sent shivers down my spine. Then, I saw it, a flicker of movement in the shadows, a dark shape, shifting and swirling in the corner of the church. It was vague, indistinct, but I could feel its malevolence, its hunger. I stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. The shape in the shadows seemed to grow larger, more defined. I could make out a pair of glowing red eyes staring at me with an intense, predatory gaze. I didn't wait to see any more. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing through the empty church. I didn't stop running until I was outside, gasping for breath in the fresh air. I looked back at the church, its dark silhouette against the setting sun. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I had encountered something that day, something that was not of this world. The veil was thinning in Centralia, and the entities trapped within the darkness were becoming restless. The encounter in the church shook me to my core. It wasn't just the fear I felt, but the absolute certainty that what I had seen was real, something beyond the realm of normal explanation. The glowing red eyes, the feeling of malevolent intent. It wasn't just my imagination. It was a confirmation of the stories, the legends, the whispers that had haunted Centralia for generations. I knew I couldn't ignore what I had experienced. I couldn't just dismiss it as a hallucination or a trick of the light. Something was happening in Centralia, something dark and dangerous, and I felt a growing responsibility to uncover the truth, even if it meant facing my own fears. I started to delve deeper into the occult, researching ancient rituals, demonic entities, anything that might shed light on the presence I had sensed in the church. I consulted with paranormal investigators, historians, even a local shaman who claimed to have knowledge of the area's spiritual history. I learned that the legends of cursed land and trapped spirits were not unique to Centralia. Similar stories existed in other mining towns, places where the earth had been scarred and violated. It was believed that these places, where the veil between worlds was thin, could become gateways for dark entities, drawn to the negative energy and the lingering pain of past tragedies. The shaman I consulted told me that the fire in Centralia had amplified this effect, creating a permanent tear in the fabric of reality. He said that the entities trapped within the darkness were feeding on the energy of the fire, growing stronger, more powerful. He warned me to stay away from Centralia, to leave the town and its secrets undisturbed. But I couldn't. The image of the glowing red eyes, the feeling of the unseen hunger, haunted my dreams. I felt a strange pull towards Centralia, a sense of unfinished business. I knew that I had to go back, that I had to face whatever was lurking in the shadows. I prepared myself as best I could. I gathered information about protective symbols, ancient rituals, anything that might offer some defense against the dark forces I suspected were at work. I even started carrying a small, silver crucifix with me, a symbol of faith and protection. My next visit to Centralia was different. I wasn't just a firefighter checking monitoring wells anymore. I was a seeker, a hunter of sorts, venturing into the heart of darkness. I returned to the church, the scene of my previous encounter. The air inside was still heavy, the sense of unease even stronger than before. I walked slowly through the church, my senses on high alert, searching for any sign of the presence I had felt. I reached the corner where I had seen the dark shape. The air was noticeably colder there, a chilling reminder of the entity's presence. I examined the area closely, looking for any clue, any sign of what it might be. Then, I saw it, a small, almost imperceptible scratch mark on the wall, near the floor. It looked like it had been made by claws, sharp and pointed. I ran my fingers over the mark, feeling the rough edges. It was definitely not natural. No animal could have made such a mark. It was as if something with sharp, inhuman claws had scraped against the wall. The discovery of the scratch mark sent a shiver down my spine. It was further proof that what I had seen in the church was not just a figment of my imagination. It was real, and it was dangerous. I continued to explore the church, finding more scratch marks, more subtle signs of the entity's presence. It was as if it was taunting me, leaving behind clues, daring me to follow its trail. As I was about to leave the church, I heard a sound, a faint whisper, coming from the back of the church. It was the same name I had heard in the cemetery, the name that echoed through my dreams. The whisper was closer this time, clearer. I could almost make out the syllables, the mournful tone. It was as if the entity was trying to communicate with me, to draw me closer. I resisted the urge to follow the sound. I knew that it was a trap, a lure to draw me deeper into the darkness. I turned and left the church, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew that I was getting closer to the truth, but I also knew that I was playing a dangerous game. The entity in Centralia was not just a ghost, a remnant of the past. It was something ancient, something powerful, and it was growing stronger. And I was beginning to suspect that it was not just trapped in Centralia. It was reaching out, its influence spreading, its hunger growing. The whisper in the church was a turning point. It was no longer just about understanding the strange occurrences in Centralia. It was about recognizing the danger that was spreading beyond the town's boundaries. The entity was not confined to the fire-ravaged streets. Its influence was leaking out, infecting the surrounding areas. I realized that my research had to change. I needed to understand the nature of the entity, its origins, its purpose. I needed to find a way to contain it, to stop it from consuming everything in its path. I started to focus on the history of the region, looking for connections between Centralia and other unexplained events. I discovered that the area had a history of strange disappearances, unsolved crimes, and outbreaks of unexplained illnesses. It was as if the darkness that had taken root in Centralia had been feeding on the region's energy for centuries, growing stronger with each tragedy. I also learned about the Native American legends in more detail. They spoke of a powerful, malevolent spirit that dwelled beneath the earth, a being that demanded sacrifice and feasted on fear. They believed that the coal mines had awakened this ancient entity, and the fire had given it new life. The shaman I had consulted earlier had mentioned something similar. He had spoken of a shadow walker, a creature of darkness that could cross between worlds, feeding on the energy of the living. He warned that the shadow walker could take many forms, appearing as a human, an animal, or even a wisp of smoke. The description of the shadow walker sent a chill down my spine. It was exactly what I had seen in the church, the dark shape with the glowing red eyes. It was the entity that had whispered the name in the cemetery, the presence that haunted my dreams. I knew that I was facing something far more dangerous than I had initially imagined. It wasn't just a ghost or a trapped spirit. It was an ancient evil, a creature of pure darkness that had been unleashed upon the world. My research led me to an old, abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of Centralia. The farmhouse had been the site of a series of strange occurrences in the years leading up to the fire. Locals spoke of strange noises, flickering lights, and sightings of shadowy figures. The farmhouse had been abandoned shortly before the fire, its inhabitants fleeing in terror. I decided to explore the farmhouse, hoping to find some clue, some connection to the entity in Centralia. The air inside was thick with dust and decay, the silence broken only by the creaking of the floorboards under my feet. As I walked through the house, I felt the same sense of unease that I had felt in the church. The air was cold, heavy, and the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I explored the rooms, finding nothing of significance. The house was empty, stripped of its former life, but the feeling of presence persisted, growing stronger with each step I took. I reached the attic, a dark, dusty space filled with cobwebs and forgotten belongings. The air was even colder here, the sense of dread almost unbearable. As I searched the attic, I found a small, wooden chest tucked away in a corner. It was similar to the chest I had found in the church, old and worn, its lid covered in carvings. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the lid. I knew that whatever was inside, it was connected to the darkness that had taken root in Centralia. I took a deep breath and lifted the lid. Inside, I found a collection of old books, journals, and strange artifacts. They seemed to belong to different people, different times. There was a book of ancient spells, a journal filled with cryptic symbols, a small, bone carving of a grotesque figure. As I looked through the contents of the chest, I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The objects were radiating a dark energy, a malevolent presence that made my skin crawl. Suddenly, I heard a noise, a scratching sound, coming from the walls of the attic. It was the same scratching sound I had heard in the church, the sound of claws scraping against the walls. The scratching grew louder, closer. It sounded like something was moving inside the walls, something large and powerful. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew that I was not alone in the attic. Then, I saw it. A shadow moving behind the wall, a dark shape shifting and swirling in the darkness. It was the same entity I had seen in the church, the Shadow Walker, and it was closer now, its presence more menacing than ever. I knew that I had to get out of the house, that I was in grave danger. I turned and ran, the scratching sound echoing behind me, growing louder, closer. I didn't stop running until I was outside, far from the farmhouse. I looked back at the house, its dark silhouette against the twilight sky. I knew that I had stumbled upon something dangerous, something that was far beyond my understanding. The Shadow Walker was real, and it was hunting, and I was beginning to suspect that I was its next target. The encounter at the farmhouse solidified my worst fears. The Shadow Walker wasn't just a local legend or a figment of my imagination. It was real, it was powerful, and it was actively hunting. I was no longer just an investigator. I was a target. The hunt had become personal. I knew I couldn't face this alone. I needed help, but who would believe me? The stories of Centralia were dismissed as folklore, the whispers attributed to the fumes and the psychological impact of the abandoned town. I decided to confide in the one person who had shown me any semblance of understanding, the shaman. He listened to my story with a grave expression, his eyes filled with ancient wisdom and a hint of fear. He confirmed my suspicions. The Shadow Walker, he explained, was a primordial entity, bound to the earth but capable of crossing into our world through places where the veil was thin. The fire in Centralia, fueled by the coal and the negative energy of the town's tragedies, had become a beacon, amplifying the entity's power and allowing it to extend its reach. He told me that the Shadow Walker fed on fear and despair, growing stronger with each soul it consumed. Its goal was not just to torment individuals, but to sow chaos and destruction, to plunge the world into darkness. The shaman explained that there were ways to fight the Shadow Walker, but they were dangerous and required immense courage and sacrifice. He warned me that I was walking a perilous path, that the entity would not give up its prey easily. He gave me a series of rituals, ancient incantations, and protective symbols, explaining their significance and how to use them. He stressed the importance of faith, not just in a religious sense, but in the power of good to overcome evil. Armed with this knowledge, I returned to Centralia, not with fear, but with a grim determination. I knew what I had to do. I had to confront the Shadow Walker, to stop it before it could spread its darkness any further. I went to the church, the place where I had first encountered the entity. The air was heavy with its presence, the silence broken only by the crackling of the fire beneath the town. I performed the first ritual, an incantation designed to ward off evil spirits. I drew the protective symbols on the walls of the church, invoking the power of light and protection. As I chanted the incantation, the temperature in the church dropped dramatically. The shadows seemed to deepen, to writhe and twist. I could feel the entity's presence growing stronger, its anger palpable. Suddenly, the church doors slammed shut, plunging the church into darkness. The scratching sound returned, echoing through the empty halls. I could hear the entity moving in the shadows, stalking me like a predator. I held my ground, my hand gripping the silver crucifix. I knew that fear was the entity's greatest weapon, and I refused to give in to it. The scratching grew closer, the sound of claws scraping against the floor. I could feel the entity's breath on my neck, a cold, chilling wind. Then, it appeared, not in its shadowy form, but in a guise that was far more terrifying. It appeared as the young woman from the portrait I had found in the chest, her eyes glowing red, her face twisted in a demonic grin. "You cannot stop me," it hissed, its voice a chilling whisper. "I am the darkness. I am the fear." I knew that this was a test, a final attempt to break my resolve. I closed my eyes, focusing on the protective symbols, the ancient incantations. I remembered the shaman's words about faith, about the power of good. I opened my eyes, my gaze fixed on the entity. "You are not welcome here," I said, my voice trembling but firm. "This is not your world." I raised the silver crucifix, reciting the final incantation, a powerful banishment ritual. The entity recoiled, its demonic form flickering and fading. The church doors burst open, flooding the church with sunlight. The scratching sound ceased, the oppressive presence lifted. The shadow walker was gone, banished back to the darkness from whence it came. I stood in the church, exhausted but triumphant. I had faced the darkness, and I had survived. But I knew that the fight was not over. The entity was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for another opportunity to cross over. Centralia remained a scar on the landscape, a reminder of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface. But for the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope. I had faced the Shadow Walker, and I had survived. And I knew that others could too. The fight against the darkness was a long one, but it was a fight worth fighting. The whispers in the ash might never be silenced completely, but perhaps, just perhaps, they could be whispers of warning, not of despair. Whispers of the Himalayas. The biting wind whipped at my face, stinging my cheeks even through the thick layers of mountaineering gear. Around me, the Himalayas stood like jagged, snow-capped teeth against the bruised purple sky. We were high, very high, nearing the infamous Rupkund Lake, the Lake of Bones. Even seasoned climbers like myself felt a prickle of unease in this desolate, breathtaking landscape. The air itself seemed thin, not just of oxygen, but of something else, something ancient and unsettling. Our expedition was a mix of scientists and history enthusiasts, all drawn by the mystery that clung to Rupkund like the persistent mist. Hundreds of human skeletons lay scattered around the lake's edges and even within its icy depths. Who were these people? How did they die? And why were they all here, at this remote, inhospitable altitude? Carbon dating had placed their demise around the 9th century, but the circumstances remained stubbornly shrouded in enigma. Local legends spoke of a wrathful goddess, Nanda Devi, who unleashed her fury upon those who dared trespass in her sacred domain. Scientists, of course, preferred more rational explanations: a landslide, an epidemic, perhaps even a ritual sacrifice gone horribly wrong. But the sheer number of skeletons, the strange uniformity of their deaths, whispered of something more, something unnatural. I shivered, pulling my scarf tighter. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the snow-covered peaks in hues of blood orange and deep violet. It was a beautiful, terrifying spectacle. Our guide, a Sherpa named Tenzing, pointed to a dark patch on the mountainside. "Rupkund," he announced, his voice barely a whisper against the wind's howl. As we approached the lake, the air grew colder, heavier. An oppressive silence descended, broken only by the crunch of our boots on the frozen ground. The lake itself was a dark, still mirror reflecting the brooding sky. Around its edges, skeletal remains emerged from the ice, grim reminders of the tragedy that had unfolded here centuries ago. Skulls stared blankly at the sky, empty sockets filled with the darkness of ages. Limbs, brittle and fragmented, reached out from the frozen earth like skeletal fingers. The sight was both macabre and strangely compelling. It was a graveyard exposed to the elements, a testament to the ephemeral nature of human existence. We set up camp on a small, relatively flat area overlooking the lake. The wind picked up, swirling snow around our tents like ghostly dancers. As darkness fell, the temperature plummeted. Huddled inside my tent, I tried to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled deep in my bones. I glanced at my research notes, the scientific explanations for the Rupkund mystery seeming inadequate in the face of the eerie silence and the presence of so many dead. Suddenly, A sound pierced the stillness. A low, mournful wail carried on the wind. It was a sound that chilled me to the core, a sound that spoke of ancient sorrows and unspeakable horrors. I held my breath, listening intently. The wail rose and fell, echoing across the desolate landscape. It sounded like a lament. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to my colleague, Dr. Anya Sharma, who was in the tent next door. "Hear what?" she replied, her voice muffled by the tent fabric. "That wailing sound." A pause. Then, Anya's voice, tinged with nervousness. "I didn't hear anything. Probably just the wind." I wasn't convinced. The wind made a howling sound, a fierce, aggressive sound. This was different. This was a sound of grief, of pain, of something otherworldly. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone at Rupkund, that something was watching us, something ancient and malevolent, something that did not want its secrets disturbed. The wailing continued, a haunting melody of despair carried on the wind. I closed my eyes, trying to block it out, but the sound seemed to penetrate my very being, whispering of the horrors that lay buried beneath the ice of Rupkund. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that our expedition had awakened something that was best left undisturbed. The weight of the silence between the wails was almost as disturbing as the sound itself. It felt like a pregnant pause, a moment of held breath before some unknown terror was unleashed. I found myself staring at the tent fabric, half expecting some grotesque shape to materialize on the other side, illuminated by the pale moonlight. Sleep evaded me. The image of those skeletal remains, their empty sockets staring up at the sky, became indelibly etched in my mind. They seemed to be pleading, warning, silently screaming their stories into the wind. I tossed and turned, the wailing sound echoing in my head, until finally, exhaustion claimed me. But my dreams were no less disturbing than my waking hours. They were filled with images of frozen figures, reaching hands, and the chilling, mournful wail that haunted the night. The next morning, the wailing had stopped, but the oppressive atmosphere remained. The sun rose, painting the snow-capped peaks in a brilliant white, but the light seemed to have no warmth. The air was still, heavy with an unspoken dread. As we began our exploration of the lake's perimeter, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was a subtle sensation, a prickling at the back of my neck, the feeling of eyes on me, even though I could see no one. We carefully documented the skeletal remains, taking photographs and collecting samples for further analysis. The sheer number of skeletons was staggering. Men, women, and children, all perished here, at this desolate altitude. Many of the skeletons were remarkably well preserved, thanks to the freezing temperatures. Some still had fragments of clothing clinging to their bones, remnants of a life abruptly cut short. One skeleton, lying half submerged in the ice, clutched a small, intricately carved wooden amulet. It was a poignant reminder of the human lives behind the bones, the hopes and dreams that had been extinguished here. As I examined a skull, I noticed something strange. A small, circular hole in the bone, just above the temple. It looked like it had been made by a sharp object. I showed it to Anya. "Look at this," I said, pointing to the hole. "What do you think could have caused this?" Anya examined the skull closely. "It's difficult to say," she said. "It could be the result of an injury, or perhaps even a weapon. But look at the edge of the hole," I said. "It's too clean, too precise. It doesn't look like it was caused by a rock or a blunt instrument." Anya nodded slowly. "You're right," she said. "It's unusual. We found several other skulls with similar holes. It was a disturbing discovery. What could have caused such precise, circular wounds? Could it have been some kind of weapon? Or was there another, more sinister explanation?" As the day wore on, the feeling of being watched intensified. I felt a growing sense of unease, a premonition that something bad was about to happen. The silence of the lake seemed to amplify the feeling, making every rustle of the wind, every creak of the ice, sound like a whispered warning. That evening, as we sat around a small fire. The wind picked up again, carrying with it the faint scent of something. Something acrid, metallic, and strangely unsettling. It was a smell I couldn't quite place, but it made the hairs on my arms stand on end. "Do you smell that?" I asked Tenzing. He sniffed the air. "Yes," he said, his voice low. "It is the smell of the mountains. Sometimes they speak to us." "Speak to us?" I asked. "What do you mean?" Tenzing looked at me, his eyes dark and serious. "The mountains have spirits," he said. "Ancient spirits who guard their secrets. Rupkund is a sacred place. It is said that the goddess Nanda Devi still watches over this lake. She does not like those who disturb the dead." I felt a chill run down my spine. Tenzing's words echoed the legends I had heard about Rupkund, the tales of a wrathful goddess and her vengeance. I tried to dismiss them as superstition, but the feeling of unease persisted. The way Tenzing spoke, with such conviction, made it hard to completely disregard his words. It wasn't just the legends, either. It was the tangible feeling of something there, something just beyond the periphery of our perception, observing us with an ancient, unknowable intelligence. Later that night, I lay in my tent, unable to sleep. The wind howled outside, sounding like the cries of lost souls. The strange, metallic scent lingered in the air, making my stomach churn. I closed my eyes, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. The image of the carved amulet I had seen earlier kept flashing through my mind. Who had carried it? What had their life been like before it was so brutally cut short? The thought that their spirit might still be trapped here, at Rupkund, sent a shiver down my spine. Suddenly, I heard a sound outside my tent. A soft, shuffling sound, like someone walking on the snow. I held my breath, listening intently. The sound came closer, then stopped just outside my tent. I could hear the faint crunch of snow beneath unseen feet. My heart pounded in my chest. I reached for my flashlight, my hand trembling. I switched it on and pointed it towards the tent flap. Silence. I held my breath, waiting. Then, the shuffling sound started again, moving slowly around my tent. It sounded like something was circling me. I gripped my flashlight tighter, my knuckles white. I was terrified, but I knew I had to see what was out there. I slowly unzipped the tent flap and peered out. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the snow-covered landscape. I scanned the area, but I could see nothing. The only sound was the howling wind. I stepped out of the tent, my flashlight beam dancing across the snow. I walked around the tent, searching for any sign of what I had heard. But there was nothing, just the snow, the wind, and the silence. But the silence felt different now. It wasn't just empty. It felt charged, like the air before a storm. I knew, deep down, that I wasn't imagining things. Something was out there. Something was watching us. And the feeling in my gut told me it wasn't friendly. Back inside the tent, I zipped the flap shut, my hands still shaking. I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep. The image of those unseen footsteps in the snow, the lingering metallic scent, the oppressive silence. It was all too much. I felt a growing sense of panic, a desperate urge to leave Rupkund, to escape the malevolent presence that permeated the air. I woke Anya and told her what I had heard. She was skeptical at first, attributing it to my overactive imagination and the altitude. But as I described the shuffling sounds and the strange scent, I saw a flicker of unease in her eyes. "Maybe we should tell Tenzing," I suggested. Anya hesitated. "Tenzing is a superstitious man," she said. "He'll just tell us more stories about the goddess and the spirits. It won't help." "But what if there's something to it?" I argued. "What if we've disturbed something we shouldn't have?" Anya sighed. "All right," she said. "We'll talk to him in the morning." The rest of the night passed in tense silence. Every creak of the tent, every gust of wind, sent shivers down my spine. I lay awake, listening for any sound, any sign of the unseen watcher. Morning finally arrived, bringing with it a pale, weak sun. The landscape looked deceptively peaceful, the snow glistening under the morning light. But I knew the peace was an illusion. The malevolent presence was still there, lurking just beneath the surface. We found Tenzing by the fire, brewing tea. We told him about the sounds and the scent, about the feeling of being watched. He listened intently, his face grim. "The spirits are restless," he said when we finished. "They do not like our presence here. Rupkund is their domain. We have disturbed their slumber. What should we do?" I asked. Tenzing looked at the lake, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and reverence. "We must appease them," he said. "We must offer them something to show our respect." "What kind of offering?" Anya asked. Tenzing thought for a moment. "The goddess Nanda Devi is pleased by offerings of precious things," he said. "Things of beauty and value." We looked at each other, unsure what to do. We didn't have anything of great value with us. Our equipment was functional, not decorative. Then, I remembered the carved wooden amulet I had seen the day before, clutched in the hand of a skeleton. It was intricately carved, a beautiful piece of craftsmanship. "What about that amulet?" I said. "The one we saw yesterday. Could we offer that?" Tenzing considered this. "It is a powerful object," he said. "It belonged to someone who died here, but it might be enough." We retrieved the amulet from where we had left it. It felt strangely warm to the touch, as if it still held some trace of the life it had once belonged to. We took the amulet to the edge of the lake and, following Tenzing's instructions, placed it on a rock overlooking the water. Tenzing chanted a prayer in his native tongue, asking the goddess to accept our offering and to allow us to leave in peace. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence hung heavy in the air. Then, a ripple spread across the surface of the lake, as if something had moved beneath the ice. The air grew colder, and the metallic scent became stronger, almost overpowering. A sudden gust of wind swept across the lake, swirling snow around us like a whirlwind. We huddled together, shielding our faces from the stinging snow. When the wind died down, we looked at the lake. The amulet was gone. In its place, on the rock, lay a single, perfectly smooth, gray stone. It looked ancient, untouched by time. Tenzing picked up the stone and examined it. "The goddess has accepted our offering," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "We must leave now. We must not stay here any longer." We packed up our camp quickly, a sense of urgency driving us. As we descended the mountain, I looked back at Rupkund one last time. The lake was still, its surface reflecting the gray sky. But I knew that the peace was deceptive. The spirits were still there, waiting, watching. And I knew that we had been lucky to escape with our lives. We had disturbed the secrets of Rupkund, and we had paid a price. We had offered a precious object, and in return, we had been allowed to leave. But I knew that the memory of Rupkund, the chilling wail, the unseen watcher, the metallic scent, would forever haunt my dreams. The mountain had spoken, and its voice was one of ancient power and chilling dread. We had trespassed on sacred ground, and though we had left, a part of us remained there, forever bound to the icy embrace of the Lake of Bones. Echoes of the Sea. The Dei Grazia, a Canadian brigantine, sliced through the unusually calm Atlantic waters on a crisp December afternoon in 1872. Captain David Morehouse, a seasoned sailor with a weathered face and eyes that had seen countless storms, scanned the seemingly endless horizon. The air was still, almost eerily so, the sea a sheet of shimmering silver under the weak winter sun. A peculiar sense of unease, an almost imperceptible shiver, ran down his spine. He couldn't quite place it, this unsettling feeling, but something felt off. It was more than just the unusual stillness. It was a weight in the air, a sense of anticipation, though of what he couldn't fathom. It was then that his first mate, John Briggs, a man whose usual jovial demeanor was replaced by a furrowed brow, pointed towards a vessel drifting lazily a few miles to starboard. "Captain," Briggs called. his voice carrying across the quiet deck, breaking the spell of the unnerving silence. A ship adrift. Looks like she's been abandoned. Morehouse, his gaze fixed on the horizon until then, lowered his spyglass and raised it again, focusing on the derelict. It was a brigantine, much like his own, its sails slack and rigging tangled, swaying gently in the barely perceptible swell. There was no flag flying, no sign of life. A ghost ship, the words echoed in his mind, bringing with them a prickle of apprehension that tightened in Morehouse's chest. He'd heard tales whispered in taverns in every port he'd ever visited, stories of ships found adrift, their crews vanished without a trace, swallowed by the sea or claimed by some unknown horror. He'd always dismissed them as sailors' yarns, tall tales spun to entertain and frighten in equal measure. But seeing this abandoned vessel, so still, so silent, so devoid of human presence, brought those stories chillingly to life, making them feel disturbingly real. He ordered the Dei Grazia to change course, the gentle lapping of the waves against the hull suddenly seeming louder in the quiet, drawing closer to the mysterious ship. As they approached, the name painted on the bow in faded, almost ghostly letters became visible: Mary Celeste. Morehouse recognized the name. He'd heard whispers about her in various ports, rumors of a troubled voyage, whispers of misfortune clinging to her like sea mist. But nothing concrete, nothing he could put his finger on, just a general sense of unease and ill fortune surrounding the vessel. A boarding party was assembled, Morehouse himself, despite the growing unease in his gut, leading the way. They approached the Mary Celeste cautiously, their small boat bumping against the larger vessel's hull with a dull thud. The silence was unnerving, almost oppressive. It was a silence that pressed on the ears, a silence that spoke of something unnatural, something profoundly wrong. The only sound was the gentle, almost mournful lapping of the waves against the hull and the creak of the rigging, a rhythmic groan that sounded like the sighs of a dying beast. They climbed aboard, their boots echoing eerily on the deserted deck, the sound amplified in the unnatural quiet. The air was thick with a strange, musty odor, a combination of salt, damp wood, and something else, something indefinable, almost metallic, that he couldn't quite place. It was a smell that clung to the back of his throat, making his stomach churn. Everything was in its place, or at least appeared to be at first glance. The ship's wheel stood idle, as if the helmsman had simply walked away. The compass still pointed north, its needle unwavering. The sails, though tattered and showing signs of wear, hadn't been ripped or torn by a storm. It was as if the crew had simply vanished, leaving everything behind, their lives seemingly frozen in a single, silent moment. The scene felt less like a mystery and more like a stage set after the actors had all left, leaving behind only the props and the lingering echoes of their performance. Morehouse and his men, their initial apprehension now morphing into a creeping dread, began to explore the Mary Celeste, their footsteps cautious on the deserted deck. The galley was set for a meal, plates laid out, food still on the table, though now cold, congealed, and utterly unappetizing. A half-eaten breakfast lay petrified on one plate. A pot of coffee, now a thick, black sludge, sat on the stove, its surface undisturbed. It was as if the crew had been interrupted mid-meal, forced to abandon ship in a hurry, leaving behind their food, their belongings, their lives. The scene spoke of a sudden, unexpected departure, a flight born of fear or necessity, but what could have caused such a hasty retreat? In the captain's cabin, Morehouse, his hand trembling slightly, found the ship's logbook lying open on the desk. The last entry was dated November 24th, 1872, 9 days prior. The entry was mundane, detailing the weather, calm seas, light winds, and the ship's position. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing to suggest any impending danger or cause for alarm. There was no mention of any trouble, no hint of what might have happened, no cry for help, no explanation for the ship's current state. It was as if the logbook, like the ship itself, had simply stopped, its story abruptly cut short, frozen in time. Morehouse, his heart pounding in his chest, examined the charts. The Mary Celeste was far off course, drifting aimlessly in the Atlantic, hundreds of miles from her intended route. Her intended destination, according to the charts, was Genoa, Italy. There was no logical explanation for the deviation. No storms were recorded in the area during that period, no navigational errors were apparent, no signs of any struggle against the elements. It was as if the ship had been deliberately steered off course, then abandoned. Its crew vanished into thin air. The meticulous nature of the charts, the lack of any obvious mistakes, only deepened the mystery. The crew's quarters were equally undisturbed, adding another layer to the unsettling puzzle. Personal belongings were scattered about, clothes draped over chairs, books lying open on bunks, pipes resting on tables, even a half-finished letter lying on a desk, its ink long since dried. It was clear that the crew hadn't packed for a hasty departure, hadn't prepared for a long voyage in a lifeboat. Their sea chests, those essential repositories of a sailor's life, were still on board, filled with their personal items, their clothes, their keepsakes. Everything pointed to a sudden and unexplained abandonment, a departure so swift that they hadn't even had time to gather their belongings. A thorough search of the ship revealed that the ship's lifeboat was missing, a fact that initially offered a potential explanation. However, a closer inspection of the davits, the mechanisms used to launch the lifeboat, revealed a disturbing detail. The ropes appeared to have been cut, not untied, suggesting a hurried, perhaps even panicked, escape. The cut was clean, as if done with a sharp knife or axe, not frayed or broken by strain. This detail painted a picture not of a measured evacuation, but of a desperate flight. But why? What could have driven the captain and his experienced crew to abandon their seaworthy ship in such a manner, leaving behind everything they owned, their food, their water, their very means of survival? The cargo, a shipment of industrial alcohol destined for Italy, was intact and undisturbed. The barrels were securely stowed in the hold, showing no signs of tampering. Nothing had been stolen, nothing was missing, ruling out piracy as a motive. The Mary Celeste wasn't a victim of pirates, nor had she been abandoned due to a leak or a storm, or any readily apparent mechanical failure. The ship was sound, her cargo secure, her provisions seemingly untouched. The mystery deepened with every passing moment, every new detail adding to the growing sense of unease. It was as if the ship itself was mocking them, presenting a facade of normalcy while concealing a dark, unfathomable secret. As the sun began its descent towards the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the deserted deck of the Mary Celeste, Morehouse decided it was time to return to the Dei Grazia. The unsettling atmosphere of the ghost ship, its silent secrets and unanswered questions, was weighing heavily on his crew, their faces pale and drawn in the fading light. He felt it himself, a prickling sensation at the back of his neck, the feeling of being observed by something unseen, something lurking just beyond the periphery of his vision. The ship felt alive, not with the bustle of human activity, but with a strange, almost sentient presence that seemed to emanate from the very timbers. They took the Mary Celeste in tow, the thick ropes creaking under the strain, intending to bring her to Gibraltar, the nearest port. The ghostly ship, its sails still slack, followed obediently, a silent, enigmatic companion in the gathering darkness. As the Dei Grazia sailed onward, Morehouse couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone, that unseen eyes were watching them, following their every move. He kept glancing back at the Mary Celeste, its dark silhouette outlined against the darkening sky, the fading light painting it in shades of gray and black. It seemed to watch them, a silent sentinel guarding its secrets, its silence a constant, unnerving reminder of the mystery it held. That night, as the stars emerged in the inky blackness above, Morehouse found sleep impossible. He lay in his bunk, the gentle rocking of the ship doing nothing to soothe his troubled mind, his thoughts racing, trying to piece together the puzzle of the Mary Celeste. What had happened to the crew? Where had they gone? Had they met with some terrible fate? Or had they simply vanished, leaving behind their lives as if they had never been? The questions swirled in his head, unanswered, unsettling, fueling his growing sense of unease. He kept thinking about the half-eaten meal, the undisturbed belongings, the missing lifeboat with its hastily cut ropes. It didn't make sense. There was no logical explanation, no rational answer to the questions that plagued him. Unable to bear the confines of his cabin any longer, he got up and went out on deck, seeking solace in the vastness of the sea and the sky. The sea was calm, the stars shining brightly, their light casting a shimmering path across the water. The Mary Celeste trailed behind, a dark, ominous shape against the horizon, its silence even more profound in the stillness of the night. Morehouse looked at it, a shiver running down his spine despite the mild night air. He felt a presence, a sense of something ancient and malevolent lurking just beneath the surface of the water, something watching them from the depths. He remembered the stories he'd heard in countless taverns, tales of sea monsters, of vengeful spirits, of ships that sailed without crews, crewed by the damned, their sails filled with the winds of the underworld. He tried to dismiss the thoughts as mere superstition, the product of an overactive imagination fueled by fatigue and the unsettling events of the day, but the feeling persisted. He felt as if the Mary Celeste was more than just an abandoned ship. It was a gateway, a portal to something dark and unknown, something that lay hidden beneath the waves, waiting to be unleashed. He felt a growing unease, a sense of dread that he couldn't explain, a feeling that he had stumbled upon something that was best left undisturbed, something that belonged to the sea, something that was not meant for human eyes. He felt like an intruder, trespassing on a realm that was not his own, and he feared the consequences. The next day, as if mirroring his growing unease, the weather changed. The calm, placid sea turned choppy, the wind picked up, and the sky grew dark and ominous, the clouds gathering like an angry mob. A storm was brewing, the change as sudden and inexplicable as the abandonment of the Mary Celeste itself. Morehouse, his heart heavy with foreboding, ordered his crew to prepare for rough weather, but his mind was still on the ghost ship. He couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was somehow connected to the Mary Celeste, as if the sea itself was angry, disturbed by their intrusion, by their attempt to wrest its secrets from its depths. As the storm raged, the wind howling like a banshee, the waves crashing over the deck, the Dei Grazia struggled against the fury of the elements. Morehouse, his face grim, watched as the Mary Celeste, its dark shape barely visible through the driving rain and spray, was tossed about like a toy in the hands of a giant. He half expected it to break free from its tow and disappear into the storm, swallowed by the sea, its secrets forever lost to the depths. But the tow rope held, and the Mary Celeste, despite its apparent fragility, rode the storm with an almost unnatural resilience, as if protected by some unseen force. The storm, a relentless fury of wind and water, continued unabated for 3 days and nights, battering the Dei Grazia and the Mary Celeste without mercy. Morehouse and his exhausted crew fought tirelessly to keep their ship afloat, battling the wind and waves, their bodies aching, their spirits worn thin. Through it all, the Mary Celeste remained in tow, buffeted by the storm yet somehow still afloat, a constant, unsettling reminder of the mystery they had stumbled upon, its presence a silent accusation. As the storm finally began to subside, the wind lessening its howl, the waves diminishing in their fury, Morehouse, his face etched with fatigue and worry, made a difficult decision. He couldn't risk his crew any longer, couldn't expose them to the growing sense of dread that permeated the Dei Grazia, a feeling that seemed to emanate from the towed vessel. The Mary Celeste, with its dark secrets and unsettling presence, was putting them all in danger. He felt it in his gut, a primal instinct warning him away. He ordered the tow rope to be cut, the thick hemp parting with a snap that echoed through the quieting storm. With a heavy heart, he watched as the Mary Celeste, its silhouette stark against the clearing sky, drifted away, swallowed by the receding storm, disappearing into the vastness of the Atlantic. It was as if the sea, having revealed its secret, was now reclaiming it, drawing it back into its depths, hiding it from human eyes once more. He never saw the Mary Celeste again. The mystery of the ghost ship remained unsolved, a chilling reminder of the unknown that lurks beneath the surface of the sea, the unseen forces that govern the fates of men and ships. Morehouse returned to port, his mind haunted by the unanswered questions, the unsettling feeling that he had been touched by something beyond his comprehension, something ancient and powerful. The Mary Celeste became a ghost story whispered in taverns, a legend passed down through generations of sailors, a warning of the mysteries that lie hidden in the depths, waiting to be discovered, or perhaps to claim those who dare to seek them. The story of the Mary Celeste has captivated and perplexed people for over a century. Theories abound, ranging from the plausible to the fantastical. Some suggest a rogue wave or a waterspout may have caused the crew to panic and abandon ship. Others propose a mutiny, a pirate attack, or even an explosion caused by the cargo of alcohol. Yet, none of these theories fully explain the strange circumstances surrounding the ship's abandonment. The half-eaten meal, the undisturbed belongings, the missing lifeboat with its cut ropes. These details paint a picture of a sudden and unexplained evacuation, a flight from some unseen terror. Was it a natural phenomenon, a freak wave, a sudden storm? Or was it something more sinister, something supernatural, something that drove the crew to abandon their ship in a desperate bid for survival? The mystery of the Mary Celeste endures, a testament to the power of the unknown, the enduring fascination with the mysteries of the sea. It is a story that continues to haunt the imagination, a reminder that even in the age of science and technology, there are still things that defy explanation, things that lie beyond our understanding, things that whisper of the deep, the dark, and the unknown. The Mary Celeste remains a ghost ship, sailing the seas of our collective imagination, a symbol of the enduring power of mystery, a reminder that some secrets are best left undisturbed, some depths are best left unplumbed. The Pharaoh's Curse. The Valley of the Kings, 1922. The air hung heavy and still, the desert sun beating down with relentless intensity. Howard Carter, his face etched with a mixture of anticipation and exhaustion, peered into the newly discovered tomb. Years he had spent searching, driven by an almost obsessive belief in the existence of Tutankhamun's final resting place. Now, finally, the moment had arrived. The initial glimpse was tantalizing. A sealed doorway, plastered and stamped with the royal cartouche, promised untold treasures within. But it wasn't the gold that captivated Carter. It was the sense of stillness, an unnatural quiet that seemed to press down on him, a feeling that he was trespassing on something ancient and powerful. He dismissed it as nerves. Years of fruitless searching, the weight of expectation, it was enough to make anyone feel a little uneasy. He carefully documented the doorway, his team working with meticulous precision. Then, with a deep breath, he made the first incision. The air that rushed out was stale, thick with the scent of time and dust. It carried with it a faint, almost imperceptible aroma, something sweet and cloying, like dried flowers and incense, but with an underlying metallic tang that made the hairs on the back of Carter's neck prickle. It was a smell that spoke of ages past, of rituals and secrets long buried. A small hole was made, just large enough to peer through. Carter held a candle to the opening, his heart pounding in his chest. At first, he saw nothing but darkness. Then, as his eyes adjusted, shapes began to emerge. Gilded surfaces gleamed in the flickering candlelight, statues stood sentinel, and in the distance, a massive sarcophagus dominated the chamber. The gold reflected the candlelight in an almost hypnotic dance, drawing the eye deeper into the mysteries within. "Wonderful things," Carter exclaimed, his voice hushed with awe. Lord Carnarvon, his financial backer, standing beside him, nodded slowly. He too felt the strange atmosphere, the oppressive silence, but the allure of the discovery overshadowed any unease. The promise of uncovering the secrets of a lost civilization was too strong to resist. The following weeks were a whirlwind of careful excavation. The antechamber was filled with treasures beyond imagination. Golden chariots, ornate furniture, jeweled daggers, and countless other artifacts, all testifying to the wealth and power of the Boy King. But as the team worked, a series of unsettling incidents began to occur. Small things at first. A sudden gust of wind in the still air, blowing dust into their eyes. Tools going missing, only to reappear later in the most unexpected places. A strange humming sound, barely audible, that seemed to emanate from the tomb itself. The humming was low and constant, like a distant drone, and it seemed to vibrate in the very bones of those who heard it. Then, the accident started. A worker slipped and broke his leg. Another suffered a severe allergic reaction to something in the tomb, his face swelling grotesquely. A third developed a high fever, delirious and babbling about strange figures in the darkness. He spoke of shadows that moved when no one was looking, of whispers in a language he didn't understand. Carter tried to rationalize it. The desert was a harsh environment. Accidents happened, but a seed of doubt had been planted in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were disturbing something that was meant to remain undisturbed. The coincidences were piling up, becoming harder and harder to ignore. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the valley, Carter sat alone in his camp, reviewing his notes. He couldn't shake the image of the sealed doorway leading to the burial chamber itself. What secrets lay beyond, and what price would they pay for uncovering them? He felt a growing sense of foreboding, a premonition of some terrible event to come. A sudden chill swept through the camp, despite the warm desert air. The dogs began to bark frantically, their fur standing on end. Carter looked up, his heart pounding. He saw nothing, but he felt it, a presence, something unseen, watching him from the darkness. The whispers of the valley were growing louder. He felt a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, as though unseen eyes were boring into him. The desert night, usually a comfort, now felt menacing, alive with unseen things. The day they finally opened the burial chamber was fraught with tension. The atmosphere in the valley was thick with anticipation, but also with a palpable sense of dread. Even the seasoned excavators, hardened by years of working in the desert, seemed uneasy. They moved with a strange mixture of excitement and trepidation, their usual banter replaced by a hushed silence. The sealed doorway was broken, revealing a chamber even more magnificent than the antechamber. Gold gleamed everywhere, reflecting the light of their torches in a dazzling display. In the center of the room stood the massive sarcophagus, its surface covered in intricate carvings. It was an imposing structure, its sheer size hinting at the power and importance of the king it contained. As they approached the sarcophagus, the strange humming sound grew louder, resonating deep within their chests. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and the sweet, metallic scent was overpowering. Carter felt a wave of dizziness, and he stumbled, catching himself on the edge of the sarcophagus. The smell was almost sickeningly sweet, like overripe fruit mixed with something metallic and ancient. He looked down at the carvings, trying to focus his mind. They depicted scenes from the afterlife, images of gods and goddesses, and hieroglyphs that spoke of the king's journey to the underworld. But there was something else, something that made his blood run cold. Mixed in with the traditional iconography were images that seemed wrong. Among the familiar images, he saw depictions of strange, shadowy figures. They were humanoid in shape, but their features were obscured, hidden in darkness. They seemed to be guarding the sarcophagus, their presence radiating a sense of malevolent power. They were depicted in awkward poses, almost as if they were trying to hide in the shadows, and their faces, where visible, were contorted in expressions of rage and fear. Carter felt a growing unease. He had read stories of curses, ancient warnings against disturbing the tombs of the pharaohs. He had always dismissed them as superstition, but now, standing before the sarcophagus, he wasn't so sure. The air in the chamber seemed to crackle with an unseen energy, and the humming sound vibrated through his very bones. The opening of the sarcophagus was a slow, agonizing process. The heavy lid, sealed for over 3,000 years, resisted their efforts. As they finally managed to move it, a cloud of dust billowed out, carrying with it the pungent scent of decay. The dust hung in the air, illuminated by their torches, creating an eerie, almost spectral atmosphere. Inside the sarcophagus, they found another, smaller coffin, and within that, another and another. It was like a series of nested dolls, each one more ornate than the last. Finally, they reached the innermost coffin, the one that contained the mummy of Tutankhamun. The layers of gold and precious stones seemed to mock their intrusion, a testament to the king's power even in death. The sight was both breathtaking and disturbing. The king's face was covered with a golden mask, its features serene and lifelike. But beneath the mask, Carter sensed something else, something hidden, something that made him feel deeply uncomfortable. It was as if the mask was a facade, concealing something ancient and unknowable beneath. As they began to examine the mummy, the strange incidents escalated. The lights flickered and died, plunging the chamber into darkness. A sudden gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing their torches. They were left in the pitch black, the silence broken only by the sound of their own breathing. The sudden darkness was disorienting, making them feel vulnerable and exposed. Then, they heard it, a whisper, soft and sibilant, seeming to come from the mummy itself. It was a language they didn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a warning. It was a sound that chilled them to the bone, a sound that spoke of ancient power and terrible retribution. The whisper seemed to slither through the air, wrapping itself around them like a cold, clammy hand. The days following the opening of the sarcophagus were marked by a series of tragedies. Lord Carnarvon, who had been in good health just days before, suddenly fell ill. He developed a high fever, his body racked by chills. He spoke deliriously of strange dreams, of shadowy figures and ancient curses. Within a week, he was dead. His death was swift and brutal, his body ravaged by a mysterious illness that baffled the doctors. The newspapers were filled with stories of the curse of Tutankhamun. The public was captivated by the idea of an ancient curse striking down those who had dared to disturb the pharaoh's rest. Carter tried to downplay the rumors, insisting that Carnarvon's death was due to natural causes. But in his heart, he knew that something was terribly wrong. He couldn't shake the feeling that they had unleashed something malevolent upon the world. More members of the excavation team began to fall ill. They suffered from strange ailments, fevers, rashes, and inexplicable pains. Some experienced mental breakdowns, plagued by nightmares and hallucinations. One by one, they succumbed to the mysterious affliction. The once vibrant and enthusiastic team was now a shadow of its former self, gripped by fear and paranoia. Carter watched in horror as his colleagues, his friends, died one after another. He felt a growing sense of guilt, a feeling that he was responsible for their deaths. He had unleashed something terrible, something that he couldn't control. The weight of their lives pressed down on him, a constant reminder of the terrible price they were paying. He tried to find a rational explanation for the events, but nothing made sense. The symptoms were too varied, too unusual. It was as if some unseen force was targeting them, picking them off one by one. The medical experts were stumped, unable to identify the cause of the mysterious illness that was claiming their lives. He began to research ancient Egyptian beliefs about the afterlife, searching for clues, for some understanding of what they had disturbed. He learned about the concept of the ka, the soul, and the importance of preserving the body for the journey to the underworld. He read about curses, spells designed to protect the tombs from desecration. He delved into ancient texts, searching for any mention of the shadowy figures he had seen in the sarcophagus. The more he learned, the more convinced he became that they had triggered something ancient and powerful. They had trespassed on sacred ground, and now they were paying the price. He felt a growing sense of dread, a feeling that he was trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. One night, Carter sat alone in his tent, poring over his notes. He was exhausted, both physically and mentally. He hadn't slept properly in days, haunted by nightmares of the shadowy figures in the sarcophagus. Sleep offered no respite, only a continuation of the terror that gripped him during the waking hours. He looked at the photographs of the mummy, the golden mask staring back at him with an unnerving intensity. He felt a strange connection to the boy king, a sense of empathy. He wondered what Tutankhamun would think of what they had done. He felt a pang of regret, a wish that he could turn back time and leave the tomb undisturbed. Suddenly, a gust of wind blew through the tent, extinguishing the candle. Carter was plunged into darkness. He fumbled for his lighter, his heart pounding in his chest. As he finally managed to relight the candle, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The flame flickered, casting dancing shadows on the tent walls, and in that instant, he saw it. Standing in the shadows, just beyond the circle of light, was one of the shadowy figures from the sarcophagus. It was tall and gaunt, its features obscured, hidden in the darkness. It seemed to shimmer and waver, almost as if it were made of smoke and shadows. Carter froze, unable to move, his breath caught in his throat. The figure raised a hand, pointing a long, skeletal finger at him. He felt a wave of icy fear wash over him, paralyzing him with its intensity. Then, the figure spoke. The voice was a whisper, ancient and chilling, echoing in the silent tent. It spoke in a language that Carter didn't understand, but the meaning was clear. It was a death sentence. Carter knew, with a chilling certainty, that his time was running out. The figure in the shadows was a messenger, a harbinger of his impending doom. He was marked, chosen as the next victim of the Pharaoh's curse. He felt a cold dread settle in his bones, a premonition of the suffering that awaited him. He tried to reason, to find a way out of this impossible situation. He consulted with experts, scholars of ancient Egypt, hoping to find some way to appease the wrath of the Pharaoh. They spoke of rituals, of offerings, of the importance of respecting the dead. They offered him advice, ancient incantations and spells, but he knew in his heart that nothing could undo what they had done. He considered returning the artifacts, sealing the tomb once more, hoping to undo the damage they had caused. But it was too late. The curse had been unleashed, and it would not be denied. He knew that even if he returned everything, the shadow would still follow him. He became a recluse, isolating himself from the world, consumed by fear and paranoia. He saw the shadowy figure everywhere, lurking in the corners of his vision, waiting for the moment to strike. He jumped at shadows, his nerves frayed to the breaking point, always expecting the worst. He tried to document everything, to leave a record of what had happened, a warning to future generations. He wrote about the whispers in the valley, the strange incidents, the deaths of his colleagues, and the shadowy figure that haunted his dreams. He hoped that his account would serve as a testament to the power of the curse, a reminder of the consequences of disturbing the dead. But even as he wrote, he knew that it was futile. No one would believe him. They would dismiss his words as the ramblings of a madman, the product of an overactive imagination. They would never understand the true horror of what they had unleashed. One night, as a fierce sandstorm raged outside, Carter sat alone in his study, surrounded by his books and papers. The wind howled like a banshee, rattling the windows and shaking the walls. He felt a sense of impending doom, a feeling that the end was near. The storm mirrored the turmoil within him, a reflection of the chaos that had engulfed his life. Suddenly, the lights flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. Carter's heart pounded in his chest. He knew what was coming. He fumbled for his lighter, his hands trembling. As he managed to ignite the flame, he saw it. Standing in the shadows, just beyond the circle of light, was the shadowy figure. It was closer now, more distinct, its features no longer obscured. Its eyes glowed with an eerie light, burning into Carter's soul. He could see the malevolence in its gaze, the ancient hatred that fueled its existence. The figure raised its hand, and Carter felt a searing pain in his chest. He gasped for air, clutching at his heart. He knew that this was the end. He had trespassed on sacred ground, and now the Pharaoh's curse had claimed its final victim. As he fell to the floor, his vision fading, Carter saw the shadowy figure approach. It knelt beside him, its face inches from his own. He could feel its icy breath on his skin, hear its ancient whisper in his ear. The whisper spoke his name. Then, darkness. The legend of the Pharaoh's curse lived on, a chilling reminder of the power of the ancient world and the terrible consequences of disturbing its secrets. The tomb of Tutankhamun remained, a silent sentinel in the Valley of the Kings, its secrets forever guarded by the shadows. Dyatlov Pass. The wind, a savage sculptor, carved icy masterpieces across the desolate expanse of the Ural Mountains. February 1st, 1959. 9 figures, tiny specks against the immensity of the snow-covered landscape, had pitched their tent on the unforgiving slopes of Kholat Syakhl, a peak whose very name, in the Mansi tongue, echoed with foreboding, Dead Mountain. Their leader, Igor Dyatlov, a seasoned mountaineer with a reputation for meticulous planning, had charted a challenging course to Otorten, a mountain some 300 kilometers distant. But the journey they had embarked upon would take a horrifying detour, leading them not to their destination, but to an icy grave. The group was a microcosm of Soviet youth. 8 men and 2 women, students and recent graduates of the Ural Polytechnic Institute, united by a thirst for adventure and the allure of the untamed wilderness. Among them were Yuri Vizber, a bard with a talent for storytelling and filmmaking, whose camera would become an unwitting chronicler of their final days, and Ludmila Dubinina, a young woman of spirit and resilience, whose diary entries would later offer chilling glimpses into their mounting unease. They were a close-knit community, their laughter and camaraderie a fragile shield against the isolating silence of the mountains. They meticulously documented their expedition, capturing images of their progress and jotting down their thoughts in personal journals, unknowingly creating a haunting record of their descent into terror. Their camp was a testament to their experience and preparation. A sturdy tent, designed to withstand the harsh conditions, provided shelter from the relentless wind and snow. Inside, a small stove crackled, offering a meager warmth against the encroaching cold. Supplies were neatly stowed, a testament to their organized approach. They had just finished their evening meal, sharing stories and jokes, the familiar routine a comforting ritual in the face of the vast, indifferent wilderness. No one suspected that this night, this seemingly ordinary night, would be their last. The first hint of something amiss was a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The wind, which had been howling like a tormented spirit all day, abruptly ceased. An unnatural stillness descended upon the camp, amplifying the silence between the creaks of the tent fabric and the gentle hiss of the stove. It was a silence that pressed on the ears, a silence that felt watchful. It was as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. Then came the whispers, not distinct words, but a sensation of whispering, a rustling just beyond the threshold of hearing, like the rustle of dry leaves in a forest where no trees grew. It was a feeling more than a sound, a prickling unease that crept up their spines and raised goosebumps on their arms. It was the kind of sound that made you question your senses, that made you wonder if you were imagining things. Yuri Yudin, the 10th member of their expedition, had been forced to turn back due to illness before they reached the fateful slope. He was the sole survivor, spared by a cruel twist of fate. Even he, before parting ways with the group, had felt a disquieting sense of foreboding, a premonition he couldn't shake off. He later recounted how the mountain seemed to exude a strange, unsettling aura. Inside the tent, the whispers intensified. They were no longer merely a feeling. Some of the hikers began to perceive faint, distorted sounds, like the rustling of unseen wings or the echo of voices carried on a wind that wasn't blowing. The air grew heavy, charged with an unseen energy. The temperature seemed to drop even further, a cold that seeped into their bones despite the small stove. One of the hikers, Georgy Krivonischenko, attempted to inject some levity into the increasingly tense atmosphere by jokingly mentioning the mountain spirits. But his laughter sounded strained and hollow in the oppressive silence. The others exchanged nervous glances. They were experienced adventurers, well-versed in the challenges of the wilderness, but this was different. This was something else. The feeling that they were being watched, scrutinized by some unseen presence, grew stronger with each passing moment. The whispers seemed to be closing in, encircling them in a shroud of fear. Fear, raw and primal, began to gnaw at the edges of their composure. They couldn't articulate it, couldn't pinpoint the source, but the dread was palpable, a thick, suffocating blanket of terror that smothered their reason. The whispers intensified, morphing into something more distinct, more menacing. They now resembled moans, or perhaps cries carried on a wind that wasn't blowing, whispers that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the mountain. The tent, which had been their sanctuary, their refuge from the harsh elements, now felt like a claustrophobic trap. A decision was made, swift and desperate. Someone, perhaps Dyatlov, the natural leader of the group, though the precise sequence of events would forever remain shrouded in mystery, gave the order to evacuate. Panic, like a wildfire, spread through the group. Without pausing to gather their belongings, without even taking the time to dress properly for the brutal cold, they cut their way out of the tent, leaving behind their warm clothes, their food supplies, their meticulously kept diaries, everything except the primal instinct to flee. They bolted into the inky blackness, driven by an unseen terror that dwarfed the physical dangers of the freezing night. Some were barefoot, clad only in their underwear. Others snatched whatever they could find in their frantic escape, a coat, a hat. But the overwhelming urge to escape, to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the unseen horror, overrode all other considerations. They didn't even have time to grab their boots, a fatal oversight in the treacherous conditions. The scene inside the tent was one of utter chaos. The fabric was slashed open, revealing the remnants of their evening meal, their books, their personal belongings scattered haphazardly. It looked as if they had fled in a hurry, but the precise, almost surgical cuts in the tent fabric hinted at something more deliberate, something that suggested a desperate, controlled attempt to escape, not a blind, panicked rush. The tracks they left behind in the pristine snow told a chilling tale of terror. They ran in a disorganized mass, some falling, some stumbling, their footprints deep and uneven, betraying their frantic, uncoordinated flight. They didn't head for the relative safety of the treeline, which was closer, but instead ran down the exposed slope as if pursued by something relentless, something that gave them no respite. It was a flight not towards safety, but away from something far more terrifying than the cold or the darkness. One group of 5 hikers, including Dyatlov himself, managed to reach a large cedar tree near the edge of the forest. They huddled together, desperately trying to build a fire, seeking warmth and a semblance of comfort in the face of the overwhelming terror that had driven them from their camp. The charred remains of the fire, the broken branches they had used for fuel, were later discovered, a silent testament to their desperate attempt to survive the night. Another group of 4, including Dubinina, ventured further down the slope, towards a deep ravine. Their tracks were more erratic, more scattered than those of the first group, suggesting an even greater level of panic. They seemed to be searching for something, or perhaps trying to escape something that was closing in on them, something that was hunting them in the darkness. They were running for their lives, but they were running blindly, their fear blinding them to the dangers of the terrain, the treacherous ice, the unforgiving cold. They were running towards an unknown fate, a fate that would ultimately claim them all. What monstrous entity, what unimaginable horror had driven them to such desperate measures? What lurked in the shadows of the mountain, chasing them into the freezing embrace of the night? The official investigation, conducted by Soviet authorities, concluded that an unknown compelling force was responsible for the hikers' deaths, but that vague and chillingly ambiguous explanation only served to deepen the mystery, to fuel the flames of speculation and fear. The bodies were discovered weeks later, scattered across the desolate landscape, a grim tableau of death and unanswered questions. The first to be found were those huddled near the cedar tree, the remains of their fire a faint, flickering testament to their desperate struggle for survival. They were poorly dressed, their faces contorted in a silent scream of terror, their eyes wide with the horror they had witnessed in their final moments. Some showed signs of minor injuries, cuts, bruises, evidence of a desperate scramble through the undergrowth, but nothing that could explain their deaths. As the search continued, the other bodies were discovered, each one adding another layer of horror to the unfolding tragedy. Some were found in the ravine, buried under several meters of snow, their bodies broken and battered. Their injuries were far more severe than those of the first group. Ribs were fractured, skulls were crushed, and one body was missing its eyes and tongue, details that would later become the source of countless nightmares and whispered speculations. Disturbingly, these internal injuries seem to have been caused by an immense force, similar to the impact of a car crash. Yet there were no external wounds to match, no signs of the kind of trauma that would normally accompany such devastating internal damage. Adding to the macabre puzzle, some of the bodies, including those found in the ravine, exhibited unusually high levels of radiation. Their clothes tested positive for radioactive contamination. Although the source of the radiation remained elusive, a phantom menace that added another layer of fear to the already chilling mystery. The most unsettling detail of all was the state of some of the clothing. Some of the hikers' clothes appeared to have been cut or torn off, as if they had been stripped naked in the freezing cold, their bodies exposed to the elements in a final act of humiliation and cruelty. This detail, combined with the other bizarre circumstances, fueled speculation about the nature of the compelling force that had driven them to their deaths. What kind of entity would inflict such injuries, would strip its victims naked in the freezing cold? Theories abounded, each one more outlandish than the last. Could it have been an avalanche? Unlikely, given the lack of evidence of a major snow slide and the fact that the tent was cut open from the inside, suggesting a deliberate escape rather than a sudden, catastrophic event. A sudden blizzard? Possible, but it wouldn't explain the internal injuries and the radiation, the strange, almost surgical precision of the cuts in the tent fabric. A military experiment gone wrong? Perhaps, but the Soviet authorities vehemently denied any involvement, and the nature of the injuries didn't seem consistent with any known weapons technology. The local Mansi people, steeped in the lore of the mountains, whispered stories of ancient spirits and vengeful gods that dwelled in the remote peaks. They spoke of a mink, a yeti-like creature that roamed the desolate landscape, a guardian of the forbidden places, a being that punished those who dared to trespass on its domain. These legends, dismissed by many as mere folklore, suddenly seemed to take on a chilling relevance in the face of the inexplicable tragedy that had unfolded on the slopes of Kolit-Syakhl. The Dyatlov Pass incident remains one of the most enduring mysteries of the 20th century, a chilling testament to the power of the unknown, the unseen forces that can shatter the fragile illusion of our control over the natural world. Decades later, the questions still linger, unanswered, echoing in the wind that sweeps across the desolate landscape. What terrified these experienced hikers so much that they fled their tent in the middle of the night? half naked and unprepared for the brutal cold. What caused their horrific injuries? The internal damage that seemed to defy explanation. And what was the source of the radiation that contaminated their bodies and clothes? A silent, invisible threat that added another layer of fear to the already chilling mystery. The answers, if they exist, are buried deep within the frozen heart of the Ural Mountains, shrouded in silence and whispered on the wind. A chilling reminder of the unseen forces that can shatter the fragile illusion of our control over the natural world. The Dyatlov Pass incident stands as a stark reminder of the limits of human understanding, a testament to the enduring power of the unknown. The Amityville Horror. The biting November wind whipped across Long Island, carrying with it the scent of salt and the chill of approaching winter. It rattled the bare branches of the oak trees surrounding 112 Ocean Avenue, a large, three-story Dutch colonial house overlooking the Amityville River. The house, with its distinctive gambrel roof and imposing facade, seemed to stand sentinel, its windows dark and unblinking. A thin layer of frost clung to the manicured lawn, crunching softly underfoot. The only sound besides the wind was the gentle lapping of the river against the nearby docks. Inside, the scene was one of unspeakable horror. Ronald DeFeo Jr., known as Butch to his friends, had systematically murdered his entire family, his parents, Ronald and Louise, and his 4 younger siblings, Dawn, Mark, Allison, and John. The brutality of the killings was shocking. Each victim was found in their bed, shot with a .35 caliber Marlin rifle. The police were baffled. There was no sign of a struggle, no forced entry. It was as if the family had simply lain down to sleep and never woken up. The quiet suburban tranquility of the neighborhood was shattered, replaced by a chilling wave of fear and disbelief. The house itself seemed to hold its breath, the silence within its walls heavier than any noise. Dust motes danced in the faint light filtering through the windows, illuminating the grim tableau. The air was thick with the metallic tang of blood, a scent that would linger long after the bodies were removed. Detectives moved through the house, their footsteps echoing eerily in the stillness. They meticulously collected evidence, their faces grim, trying to piece together the events of that horrific night. Photographs were taken, documenting the scene in all its gruesome detail. Each room, once a space of family life and laughter, was now a testament to unspeakable violence. Butch eventually confessed to the murders, claiming he had heard voices urging him to kill his family. He spoke of a dark presence, a malevolent force that had taken control of him. The trial was a media circus. Reporters flocked to Amityville, eager to capture every detail of the gruesome story. The defense argued insanity, painting Butch as a victim of some unseen, demonic influence. They presented evidence of his troubled past, his struggles with drug abuse, and his history of violent outbursts. They claimed that he was not responsible for his actions, that he was merely a puppet in the hands of a supernatural entity. The prosecution, however, portrayed him as a cold-blooded killer, motivated by greed and a simmering resentment towards his family. They argued that the voices he claimed to hear were simply a fabrication, a desperate attempt to escape responsibility for his heinous crimes. They pointed to the lack of any concrete evidence of demonic possession, emphasizing the calculated nature of the killings. They described how Butch had reloaded the rifle after each shot, how he had methodically moved from room to room, systematically eliminating his family. The jury ultimately rejected the insanity plea, and Butch was convicted on 6 counts of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. The verdict brought a measure of closure to the community, but the questions remained. What had driven Butch to commit such a horrific act? Was it simply a case of a troubled young man driven to madness, or was there something more sinister at play? The whispers of a dark presence, a malevolent force within the house, continued to circulate, fueling the growing legend of 112 Ocean Avenue. The house at 112 Ocean Avenue became infamous, a symbol of unimaginable violence. The bloodstains were cleaned, the bullet holes patched, but the lingering sense of dread remained. The locals whispered stories of the DeFeo family, their lives tragically cut short, their spirits forever trapped within the walls of the house. Some claimed to hear faint cries in the night, the echo of children's laughter followed by the chilling report of a rifle. Others swore they had seen ghostly figures moving in the darkened windows, the shadows of the DeFeos reliving their final moments. The house became a local pariah, avoided by those who feared its dark reputation. The house remained empty for over a year, a pariah in the otherwise peaceful neighborhood. No one dared to buy it. No one dared to live in the place where such a horrific tragedy had unfolded. The whispers grew louder, the legends more elaborate. The house at 112 Ocean Avenue was now more than just a crime scene. It was a place of darkness, a place of evil. It stood vacant, a silent testament to the horrors that had occurred within its walls, waiting for its next victims. The real estate listing quietly mentioned the historic nature of the property, omitting any mention of the gruesome events that had transpired there. The price, however, was significantly lower than comparable homes in the area, a silent lure for those brave enough, or perhaps foolish enough, to ignore the chilling tales. In December 1975, a year after the murders, George and Kathleen Lutz, a young couple with 3 children, decided to take a chance. They had been searching for a larger home, a place where their family could grow and thrive. Their current house was cramped and no longer suited their needs. They dreamed of a spacious home with a big yard for their children to play in, a place where they could build lasting memories. The house at 112 Ocean Avenue, despite its dark history, seemed to be the answer to their prayers. It was spacious, beautifully situated on the water, and, most importantly, the price was significantly lower than comparable properties in the area. The real estate agent, while subtly avoiding the specifics of the house's past, emphasized the unique opportunity and the motivated seller. The Lutz family, perhaps blinded by the opportunity to own such a beautiful home at such a bargain price, dismissed the rumors and the chilling history. They told themselves that the stories were just that, stories exaggerated by local gossip and sensationalized by the media. They saw it as just a house, a building, not a repository of evil. They focused on the positive aspects, the large, sun-drenched rooms, the inviting fireplace, the picturesque view of the Amityville River. They envisioned their children playing in the spacious backyard, enjoying picnics on the lawn, and swimming in the river during the warm summer months. They moved in just before Christmas, eager to start a new chapter in their lives. The children, Danny, Christopher, and Missy, were excited about their new rooms and the prospect of exploring the large backyard. George, a boat builder, appreciated the dock and the easy access to the bay. He imagined spending his weekends fishing and boating with his family, enjoying the tranquility of the waterfront. Kathleen, a stay-at-home mom, enjoyed the spacious kitchen and the bright, sun-filled rooms. She envisioned herself hosting family gatherings and creating a warm and welcoming home for her loved ones. The first few weeks were uneventful. The house seemed normal, even welcoming. The fresh coat of paint and the new carpeting masked any lingering signs of the previous tragedy. The children quickly settled into their new routines, making friends in the neighborhood and exploring their surroundings. George busied himself with minor repairs and renovations, eager to personalize the space and make it their own. Kathleen decorated the house with their family photos and cherished belongings, attempting to infuse the space with warmth and positive energy. But as the winter deepened, a subtle shift began to occur. A feeling of unease settled over the house, a sense of something unseen, something malevolent lurking just beyond the periphery of their vision. It started with small things, a strange, cloying odor that came and went without explanation, like the faint smell of decay mixed with something sickly sweet. Cold spots in certain rooms, pockets of icy air that seemed to cling to the walls and floors, the unsettling feeling of being watched even when they were alone, the distinct sensation of unseen eyes following their every move. The noises began subtly, almost imperceptibly, faint whispers in the dead of night, just at the edge of hearing, like someone murmuring secrets in a language they couldn't understand. The sound of doors creaking open and closing when no one was there. A draft they couldn't locate. The distinct impression of footsteps on the upper floors when the children were asleep. A heavy tread that echoed through the silent house. George, a pragmatic man, tried to rationalize these occurrences. He blamed the old house's settling, the wind whistling through cracks in the windows, the plumbing. He told himself that his imagination was getting the better of him, that he was simply being overly sensitive to the creaks and groans of an old house. But deep down, a seed of doubt began to sprout in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, that the house was harboring a dark secret. Kathleen, more sensitive to the atmosphere of the house, felt it even more acutely. She described a constant feeling of dread, a weight on her chest that made it difficult to breathe. It was as if an invisible presence was pressing down on her, suffocating her with its negativity. She started having nightmares, vivid dreams of shadowy figures lurking in the corners of the house, of disembodied voices whispering her name. She would wake up in the middle of the night, her heart pounding, convinced that she had heard someone calling her from the darkness. The feeling of being watched intensified, a constant, unnerving sensation that made her skin crawl. She began to feel isolated and vulnerable, trapped in a house that seemed to be turning against her. The strange occurrences at 112 Ocean Avenue escalated, moving beyond unsettling to overtly terrifying. The subtle unease that had initially permeated the house morphed into outright fear, a palpable presence that clung to the walls and seeped into the very fabric of their lives. The noises became louder, more distinct, no longer easily dismissed as the quirks of an old house. The whispers turned into chilling moans, guttural sounds that seemed to emanate from the depths of the house, filled with pain and despair. The doors would slam shut with tremendous force, rattling the entire house, shaking the windows in their frames. The cold spots intensified, becoming pockets of icy air that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, chilling them to the bone even in the warmest rooms. The Lutz family began to witness more disturbing phenomena, visual manifestations that defied explanation. They saw shadows moving in the periphery of their vision, fleeting glimpses of dark figures darting across hallways or disappearing around corners when they turned to look directly. Objects would move on their own, seemingly defying gravity. A kitchen knife would fly across the room, narrowly missing Kathleen as she was preparing dinner. A heavy armchair would inexplicably tip over, crashing to the floor with a resounding thud. Doors would lock and unlock themselves. Lights would flicker and go out, plunging the house into sudden darkness. Missy, the youngest of the children, claimed to have an imaginary friend named Jody. At first, George and Kathleen dismissed it as a child's fantasy, a way for Missy to cope with the strangeness of their new home. But Missy's descriptions of Jody were unsettling. She described him as a tall, shadowy figure with glowing red eyes, a creature of darkness that only she could see. She would often be found talking to Jody in her room, her voice hushed and fearful, as if she was confiding in a dangerous secret. She would draw pictures of Jody, depicting him as a tall, gaunt figure with piercing red eyes and a sinister smile. These drawings, with their disturbing imagery, sent chills down Kathleen's spine. George's behavior began to change, mirroring the growing darkness within the house. He became irritable, short-tempered, prone to fits of anger. He would lash out at his family over trivial matters, his patience wearing thin, his words laced with venom. He would wake up in the middle of the night, convinced that he had heard someone calling his name, a disembodied voice whispering his name from the shadows. He felt a constant sense of paranoia, as if he was being watched, judged, his every action scrutinized by unseen eyes. He started spending hours in the basement, feeling drawn to the cold, damp space. He claimed he felt a strange connection to the house, a sense of understanding its dark secrets, a compulsion to uncover the source of the evil that permeated its walls. He would sit in the darkness for hours, listening to the silence, feeling the oppressive weight of the house's history pressing down on him. Kathleen, meanwhile, became increasingly withdrawn and fearful, her spirit crushed by the relentless haunting. She felt trapped in the house, a prisoner of its malevolent presence, her hope dwindling with each passing day. She started seeing a priest, Father Mancuso, seeking his help and guidance. She confided in him about the terrifying experiences she and her family were enduring, begging him to intervene. Father Mancuso, initially skeptical, visited the house briefly. As soon as he stepped inside, he too felt an oppressive atmosphere, a sense of profound evil that seemed to cling to the very air. He blessed the house, reciting prayers and sprinkling holy water, but his attempts seemed to have little effect. The oppressive presence remained, the feeling of dread intensified. He left the house shaken, unable to offer any real comfort or explanation. The haunting intensified, reaching a fever pitch. The Lutz family was living in a constant state of terror, their lives consumed by the supernatural forces that had taken hold of their home. They were trapped in a nightmare, a real-life horror movie playing out within the walls of 112 Ocean Avenue, their sanctuary transformed into a prison of fear. The house, once a symbol of their dreams, had become their tormentor. The relentless paranormal activity at 112 Ocean Avenue took its toll on the Lutz family, pushing them to the brink of despair. They were exhausted, both physically and emotionally, their reserves of strength depleted by the constant fear and lack of sleep. Sleep became a luxury, a distant memory, as they were constantly awakened by the terrifying noises, the slamming doors, the disembodied whispers, and the chilling feeling of being watched. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside their windows, sent shivers down their spines. They lived in a perpetual state of high alert, their senses heightened, their nerves frayed. Their relationships suffered under the immense strain. George and Kathleen, once a loving and supportive couple, argued constantly, their nerves frayed, their patience worn thin. The constant fear and the inability to find a solution created a wedge between them, eroding their trust and understanding. They blamed each other for their predicament, their frustration and anger finding an easy target in the person closest to them. The children, once carefree and happy, were now withdrawn and fearful, their innocent childhood shattered by the constant presence of terror. They clung to their parents, seeking comfort and reassurance, but even their parents were unable to offer them the safety and security they craved. One particularly terrifying night, the family witnessed a dark, shadowy figure materialize at the foot of their bed. It was tall and menacing, its features obscured by darkness, a void in the dim light of their bedroom. It exuded an aura of pure evil, a palpable sense of malevolence that filled the room. George, despite his fear, screamed at it to leave, his voice hoarse and trembling, but the figure remained motionless, unmoved by his pleas. The room grew intensely cold, the temperature plummeting dramatically, and a foul, sulfurous smell filled the air, choking them with its putrid stench. The figure then vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind a lingering sense of dread, a chilling reminder of the evil that resided within their home. This was the breaking point. The Lutzes knew they could no longer stay in the house. They had tried to rationalize the strange occurrences, to explain them away as the product of their imaginations or the eccentricities of an old house. But the events of that night, the tangible presence of evil in their bedroom, shattered their denial. They realized that they were dealing with something far beyond their understanding, something truly malevolent, a force that threatened to consume them all. The fear was no longer something they could manage. It was a living, breathing entity within the house, feeding on their terror. They contacted a team of paranormal investigators, led by Ed and Lorraine Warren, renowned demonologists who had investigated numerous cases of hauntings and demonic possession. The Warrens, after conducting their own investigation, spending time in the house and interviewing the Lutzes, confirmed the presence of a demonic entity within the house. They, too, felt the oppressive atmosphere, the chilling presence that permeated every room. They believed that the house was not just haunted, but possessed, a gateway for evil spirits, a portal through which demonic forces could enter the human world. Their years of experience with the supernatural allowed them to recognize the signs, the telltale marks of a demonic infestation. The Warrens' investigation revealed a disturbing history of the property, a history that shed light on the dark forces that plagued the house. They discovered that the house had been built on an ancient Native American burial ground, a place considered sacred by the indigenous people, a place where spirits were believed to roam. They also uncovered evidence of occult practices and satanic rituals that had been performed on the land, further desecrating the site and attracting negative energies. They concluded that the demonic entity was feeding on the negative energy that had accumulated over the years, fueled by the violence and suffering that had occurred within the walls of the house, empowered by the dark history of the land itself. The Lutz family, with the help of the Warrens, made the agonizing decision to leave the house. It was a decision born of desperation, a last resort to save themselves and their children from the clutches of the demonic entity that had invaded their lives. They packed their belongings in a hurried, frantic manner, taking only what was absolutely essential, leaving behind the furniture, the children's toys, the photographs that captured happier times, all the material possessions that had once defined their lives. They fled in the middle of the night, under the cloak of darkness, not daring to look back at the house that had become their prison. They drove away from Amityville, their hearts pounding, their minds filled with fear and uncertainty, unsure of what the future held, but knowing that they could no longer stay in the house that had become a gateway to hell. The house at 112 Ocean Avenue stood silent once more, its dark secrets hidden behind its imposing facade. The Lutz family's escape did not appease the evil that resided within its walls. The demonic entity remained, waiting, its power amplified by the fear it had instilled, its appetite for suffering insatiable. The house became a focal point for paranormal investigators, curious onlookers, and thrill-seekers, all drawn to the infamous address, eager to experience the chilling atmosphere and perhaps catch a glimpse of the supernatural phenomena that had terrorized the Lutzes. Some who dared to venture inside reported feeling a sense of unease, a chilling presence that made their skin crawl. Others claimed to have heard whispers, seen shadows moving in the darkened rooms, and felt the icy touch of unseen hands. The legend of the Amityville horror grew, fueled by the Lutz's accounts and the Warrens' investigations. Books were written, movies were made, and the story of 112 Ocean Avenue became a cultural phenomenon, a chilling reminder of the existence of evil, a testament to the power of the supernatural. The house itself became a tourist attraction, a macabre landmark for those fascinated by the paranormal. Despite its dark history, the house was eventually sold again, and new families moved in, each hoping that the stories were just that, stories, exaggerations of a troubled past. But the whispers persisted, the legends continued, and the house at 112 Ocean Avenue remained a symbol of fear, a chilling reminder of the evil that lurks in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity to prey on the unsuspecting. The Lutz family, after their harrowing experience, struggled to rebuild their lives. They carried the emotional scars of their encounter with the demonic entity, the memories of the terror they had endured forever etched into their minds. They moved from place to place, trying to escape the notoriety that followed them, attempting to find a sense of peace and normalcy. They changed their names, hoping to leave the nightmare behind them, but the shadow of Amityville lingered, a constant reminder of the evil they had faced. They learned to live with the fear, to cope with the trauma, but the experience had changed them forever. They had glimpsed the darkness that exists beyond the veil of reality, and they knew that it was real, that it was powerful, and that it could strike at any time, turning a place of dreams into a house of horrors. The Amityville house became a symbol of the fragility of peace and the enduring power of fear, a chilling tale whispered in the dark, a reminder that some doors are best left unopened. Germany's unsolved farmhouse massacre. The biting Bavarian wind howled around the isolated farmstead of Hinterkaifeck, a lonely speck against the backdrop of the dense, ancient forest. It was the winter of 1922, a time of hardship and unease, and the Gruber family, who called this remote place home, felt the chill deeper than the frosty air. Andreas Gruber, the gruff patriarch, his wife Cecilia, their daughter Victoria, her husband Karl Gabriel, and their two young children, Cecilia and Joseph, lived a life of quiet isolation. Their days dictated by the rhythm of the farm and their nights shrouded in the impenetrable darkness of the woods. For months, an unsettling feeling had permeated the farmhouse, a sense of being watched, of unseen eyes following their every move. It started subtly, with the distinct sound of footsteps in the attic, a heavy tread that echoed through the silent house when all its inhabitants were accounted for. Andreas, a practical man, initially dismissed it as the settling of the old house, the creaking of timbers in the winter chill. But the footsteps persisted, growing bolder, more frequent, until they became an undeniable presence. Then came the discovery of the strange tracks in the snow, leading to the farm but not away. They were his own, Andreas realized with a shiver, but he hadn't been outside that night. The unsettling realization that someone, or something, had been walking around his property unseen, unheard, sent a prickle of fear down his spine. He searched the farm thoroughly, every barn, every shed, even the dense woods bordering his land, but found nothing. No sign of an intruder, no broken fences, no disturbed earth. Just the whispering wind and the oppressive silence of the forest. The family grew increasingly uneasy. Victoria, a young woman with a vivid imagination, spoke of feeling a cold breath on her neck when she was alone, of shadows flickering in the corners of her eyes. Karl, her husband, a man of science and logic, tried to rationalize their fears, attributing them to the isolation and the long, dark nights. But even he couldn't deny the palpable shift in the atmosphere of the house, the heavy feeling of dread that hung in the air. Old Cecilia, a woman steeped in the folklore of the region, whispered stories of ancient spirits and haunted woods, tales that had been passed down through generations. She spoke of the Walgeist, the spirit of the forest, a creature of both benevolence and malice, capable of protecting those who respected it and punishing those who dared to trespass on its domain. Her words, though meant to comfort, only fueled the growing sense of dread within the house. Andreas, despite his outward gruffness, found himself increasingly on edge. He started sleeping with his hunting rifle close at hand, his senses heightened, listening for any unusual sound in the night. He reinforced the doors and windows, adding extra locks and bolts, a futile attempt to barricade themselves against an unseen threat. The whispers in the walls continued, sometimes accompanied by faint scratching sounds, as if some creature was trying to claw its way into the house. The family huddled together at night, seeking comfort in each other's presence, their fear a tangible thing in the darkness. Sleep offered little respite, their dreams plagued by shadowy figures and the sound of those incessant footsteps. One cold, bleak day in March, something shifted. The atmosphere in the house grew heavier, more oppressive. The whispers intensified, becoming almost audible voices, murmuring in a language they didn't understand. A chilling draft swept through the house, even with all the windows and doors tightly closed. The family huddled in the main room, a fire roaring in the hearth, but the warmth couldn't penetrate the icy grip of fear that held them captive. That night, the footsteps weren't just in the attic. They were downstairs in the hallway, just outside their door. The morning of April 3rd, 1922, dawned unusually bright and clear. The sun cast a warm glow on the snow-covered fields, the air crisp and fresh. But the peacefulness of the day was shattered by a chilling discovery. Andreas Gruber, the gruff patriarch of the Hinterkaifeck family, was found dead in the barn, his body battered and bruised. His wife, Cecilia, was discovered in the house, her neck broken. Their daughter, Victoria, and her husband, Carl, were also found dead, their bodies buried under a pile of hay in the barn. The two young children, Kazilia and Joseph, were missing. The news spread like wildfire through the small village, sending shockwaves through the community. The Hinterkaifeck family, once a pillar of the community, had been brutally murdered. The village was gripped by fear and suspicion, everyone wondering who could have committed such a heinous crime. The police were baffled. There was no evidence of forced entry, no signs of a struggle. The only clues were the strange tracks in the snow, leading to the farm but not away, and the whispers in the walls, which had been reported by the family before their deaths. The village was divided into two factions: those who believed that the killer was human, and those who believed that it was something else, a supernatural force that had descended upon the Hinterkaifeck farm. The police, determined to solve the case, conducted a thorough investigation. They questioned every villager, searched the farm, and examined every piece of evidence. But they came up empty-handed. There was no motive, no weapon, no suspect. The case of the Hinterkaifeck murders remained unsolved, haunting the village for years to come. The Hinterkaifeck farmhouse, once a symbol of family and community, became a symbol of fear and mystery. The whispers in the walls continued, growing louder and more menacing, as if mocking the authorities for their failure to solve the case. The Hinterkaifeck murders have become one of the most famous unsolved mysteries in German history. The identity of the killer remains unknown, and the whispers in the walls continue to haunt the farm to this day. Part 3. The Haunting. The Hinterkaifeck farmhouse, once a symbol of family and community, had become a symbol of fear and mystery. The whispers in the walls continued, growing louder and more menacing, as if mocking the authorities for their failure to solve the case. In the years that followed the murders, the farmhouse remained abandoned, its windows boarded up and its doors locked. The villagers avoided the place, fearing the supernatural forces that were said to haunt it. One day, a young couple, Hans and Elsa, decided to purchase the farmhouse, hoping to restore it to its former glory. They were undeterred by the rumors of the haunting, believing that they could exorcise the evil spirits that were said to dwell within the walls. They moved into the farmhouse, eager to start their new life. But their happiness was short-lived. Almost immediately, they began to experience strange and terrifying occurrences. They heard the whispers in the walls, growing louder and more threatening each day. They saw shadows moving in the corners of the room, and they felt a cold presence watching them from the darkness. One night, Hans was awakened by a loud bang. He rushed downstairs to investigate and found that a window had been smashed open. He searched the house, but found no intruder. The next day, Elsa disappeared. Hans searched for her for days, but she was never found. The village was once again gripped by fear. The Hinterkaifeck farmhouse was once again the center of attention, and the whispers in the walls grew louder and more menacing than ever before. Hans, desperate for answers, decided to seek help from a local exorcist. The exorcist performed a series of rituals, but to no avail. The whispers continued, and the haunting grew stronger. Hans, unable to bear the terror any longer, abandoned the farmhouse, leaving it to the ghosts that had claimed it as their own. The Hinterkaifeck farmhouse remains abandoned to this day, a chilling reminder of the unsolved murders that took place there. The whispers in the walls continue to haunt the farm, a constant reminder of the evil that dwells within. The Doll Island's Lament. The salt spray stung my face as I wrestled with the stubborn outboard motor. My little fishing boat, a relic of my grandfather's, coughed and sputtered, protesting the choppy waters that surrounded Isla de las Muñecas, the island of the dolls. I'd heard the stories, of course. Every fisherman in these parts knew them. Whispers of a cursed place, an island where dolls outnumbered the living, their vacant eyes staring out at the sea. They said a girl had drowned there years ago, and the dolls were offerings to appease her restless spirit. Superstition? I'd scoffed. Just colorful local folklore. I was a practical man, a marine biologist, and I was here to study the unusual ecosystem around the island, not chase ghost stories. But the engine's persistent refusal to cooperate was starting to make me reconsider my skepticism. The sky was darkening, the once vibrant sunset now bleeding into bruised purples and ominous grays. A storm was brewing, and I was stuck. The island loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the turbulent sea. It looked desolate, unwelcoming. Even from this distance, I could see them, the dolls, perched on trees, clinging to crumbling buildings, scattered across the beach like grotesque toys left out in the rain. Finally, with a groan and a shudder, the engine gave up the ghost. Dead. I cursed my luck. No radio, no flares, just me, a broken-down boat, and an island of creepy dolls. I grabbed my emergency kit, a waterproof backpack containing a few essentials, and reluctantly lowered the small inflatable raft. The waves were getting bigger, pushing me towards the shore. The landing was rough. The raft bounced against the rocky beach, nearly throwing me overboard. I dragged it ashore, the sand cold and damp beneath my feet. The air was thick with a strange, almost sweet, smell, like decaying flowers and damp earth. It was unsettling. I pulled out my flashlight, its beam cutting through the gathering gloom. The island was silent, save for the crashing waves and the mournful cry of some unseen bird. As I ventured further in, the dolls became more prominent. They were everywhere. Dolls of all shapes and sizes, some missing limbs, some with cracked faces, some dressed in tattered clothes. They were tied to trees with ropes, their plastic eyes staring blankly ahead. Some were hanging by their necks, swaying gently in the wind, creating a macabre dance. It was a truly disturbing sight. I tried to shake off the unease that was creeping over me. It was just my imagination, I told myself. Just a creepy island with a lot of old dolls. But even as I said the words, I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something about this place that felt wrong, deeply wrong. I decided to find some shelter. The storm was coming, and I didn't want to spend the night exposed to the elements. I spotted a small, dilapidated shack further inland. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, but it was better than nothing. As I approached, I noticed a doll sitting on the porch. It was a large doll, with porcelain skin and long, tangled hair. Its eyes were open, staring right at me. I hesitated, then cautiously stepped closer. As I did, I heard a faint whisper, carried on the wind. It sounded like a child's voice, soft and mournful. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound sent shivers down my spine. I shone my flashlight on the doll. Its eyes seemed to follow me. I quickly averted my gaze. This was getting to me. I was letting my imagination run wild. I needed to focus on finding shelter and surviving the storm. I pushed open the door of the shack. It creaked and groaned, as if in protest. The inside was dark and damp, filled with the smell of mildew and decay. Dust motes danced in the beam of my flashlight. The room was sparsely furnished, with a broken chair, a rickety table, and a pile of straw in the corner that looked like it had once served as a bed. As I scanned the room, I noticed something else. More dolls. They were everywhere, sitting on the shelves, perched on the windowsills, lying on the floor. Their eyes seemed to watch me, their silent presence adding to the growing sense of unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that I wasn't alone. The wind picked up, rattling the windows and shaking the shack. The storm was upon us. I closed the door, trying to block out the howling wind and the incessant whispers that seemed to be carried on its breath. I huddled in the corner, trying to ignore the staring eyes of the dolls that surrounded me. This was going to be a long night. The storm raged outside, a symphony of wind and rain battering the little shack. Inside, the silence was almost more unnerving. The only sound was the occasional creak of the old wood and the soft rustle of the doll's tattered clothes as the wind seeped through cracks in the walls. I tried to distract myself, rummaging through my backpack. I found a small, waterproof container of matches and a few protein bars. Not exactly a feast, but it would have to do. I managed to light a small fire in the dilapidated fireplace, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. The light helped a little. It pushed back the oppressive darkness and offered a small measure of comfort. But even the fire couldn't chase away the feeling of being watched. The dolls seemed to be everywhere, their eyes following my every move. I could almost feel their gaze on me, cold and piercing. As the night wore on, my unease grew. The whispers on the wind seemed to intensify, becoming clearer, more distinct. I still couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a sound of sorrow, of pain, of something lost. It was a sound that chilled me to the bone. I tried to rationalize it. It was just the wind, I told myself, just the old house settling. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. There was something wrong here, something unnatural. The air felt thick with a heavy, oppressive energy. It was as if the island itself was alive, watching me, waiting. Suddenly, the fire crackled and popped, sending a shower of sparks into the air. One of the sparks landed on a doll that was sitting on the hearth. The doll's tattered dress caught fire. Flames quickly engulfed the doll, its plastic body melting and distorting in the heat. The smell was acrid, sickeningly sweet. As the doll burned, I noticed something strange. The other dolls in the room seemed to be watching, their eyes fixed on the burning figure. And then, I heard it, a distinct giggle, high-pitched and chilling. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was a sound that made my blood run cold. I scrambled back, away from the fire, my heart pounding in my chest. The burning doll's face was now a grotesque mask of melting plastic, its eyes still staring, even as the flames consumed it. The giggle continued, echoing through the shack. I felt a wave of panic wash over me. I had to get out of here. I grabbed my backpack and stumbled towards the door. As I reached for the handle, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow moved across the wall, fleeting and indistinct. I whipped around, my flashlight beam dancing across the room, but there was nothing there. I hesitated, my hand still on the door handle. Was I imagining things? Was the stress of the storm and the isolation getting to me? I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. I was a scientist, a man of logic. There was no such thing as ghosts or haunted dolls. It was all just superstition and folklore. But even as I tried to convince myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I could feel the eyes of the dolls on me, even in the darkness. I could hear the whispers on the wind, growing louder, more insistent. And then I saw it again. The shadow. This time, it was closer, more distinct. It was moving along the wall, just outside the beam of my flashlight. It was tall and thin, with a hunched silhouette. It looked human. My breath caught in my throat. I shone my flashlight towards the shadow, my hand trembling. The beam of light landed on the wall, revealing nothing. But as I moved the light, I saw something else. A pair of eyes, glowing in the darkness. They were small and bright, like the eyes of an animal. They were fixed on me, watching me from the shadows. I froze, my blood running cold. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I was not alone in the shack. Something was there with me, something that was not of this world. And it was watching me, waiting. The giggle started again, closer this time, right behind me. I didn't dare turn around. I knew, instinctively, that if I did, I would see something that would forever haunt my nightmares. I stumbled back, my foot catching on something. I fell to the ground, my flashlight falling from my hand and rolling away into the darkness. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the sound of something moving in the darkness, something creeping closer. I could feel its presence, cold and malevolent. I had to get out of there. I fumbled for the door handle, my fingers brushing against something cold and smooth. I recoiled in horror. It was a doll's hand. I could feel its grip tightening around my wrist. I screamed, pulling away with all my might. The doll's hand released its grip, and I stumbled backwards, falling through the open door and into the storm. I stumbled out into the storm, the wind and rain lashing against me. The darkness was almost absolute, the only light coming from the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated the island in brief, stark bursts. Behind me, I could hear the giggle again, closer now, echoing through the storm. I didn't look back. I ran. I ran blindly through the darkness, stumbling over rocks and fallen branches. The island seemed to be alive, reaching out to trip me, to hold me back. The wind howled in my ears, carrying the whispers that seemed to be calling my name. I could feel the eyes of the dolls on me, even in the darkness. They were everywhere, watching me, waiting. I didn't know where I was going. I just ran, driven by a primal fear that I had never felt before. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs ached. I ran until I collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath. I lay there for a long time, the rain soaking me to the bone. The storm raged around me, but I barely noticed it. My mind was numb, my senses overwhelmed. I had seen something in that shack, something that I couldn't explain, something that had shaken me to my core. As I lay there, I started to hear the whispers again. They were still faint, carried on the wind, but they were clearer now. I could almost make out the words. They sounded like a name, a girl's name. I couldn't be sure, but I thought I heard them say Luisa. The name resonated with me. I had read about the legend of Isla de las Muñecas, the story of the girl who had drowned in the waters surrounding the island. Luisa, they said her spirit was trapped on the island, and the dolls were offerings to appease her. A chilling thought occurred to me. What if the stories were true? What if the dolls weren't just inanimate objects? What if they were vessels for something else, something malevolent? I shivered, despite the rain. I had to get off this island. But how? My boat was wrecked, and I had no way to signal for help. I was trapped, just like Luisa. As I lay there, a strange calm came over me. I realized that I couldn't run anymore. I had to face whatever was happening. I had to understand. I got to my feet, my body aching, my mind still reeling. I decided to go back to the shack. I knew it was dangerous, but I had to find out what was going on. I had to understand the mystery of the dolls. I made my way back through the storm, the wind and rain still lashing against me. As I approached the shack, I noticed that the fire had gone out. The shack was dark, silent. The only light came from the flashes of lightning that illuminated the island in brief, eerie glimpses. I hesitated at the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. I stepped inside. The shack was even more unsettling in the darkness. The shadows seemed to writhe and twist, taking on grotesque shapes. The dolls were still there, their eyes staring at me from the darkness. But now, they seemed different, more alive. I shone my flashlight around the room, my beam dancing across the walls. As I did, I noticed something that I hadn't seen before. A small, wooden box tucked away in a corner. It looked old, antique. I cautiously approached the box. It was covered in dust and cobwebs. I opened it carefully. Inside, I found a doll. But this doll was different from the others. It was small, delicate, with porcelain skin and long, flowing hair. It was dressed in a white dress, and it held a small, faded photograph in its hand. I picked up the photograph. It was a picture of a young girl. She had long, dark hair and bright, smiling eyes. She looked familiar. Then it hit me. It was Luisa. As I looked at the photograph, I heard a whisper, soft and clear. "Help me," it said. I looked around the room, but there was no one there. The whisper seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Who said that?" I asked, my voice trembling. "It's me," the whisper replied. "Luisa." I stared at the photograph, my mind reeling. "But how?" I stammered. "I'm trapped," Luisa's whisper said. "Trapped on this island. The dolls, they hold my spirit. They keep me here." "But why?" I asked. "Why are you trapped?" "They say I drowned," Luisa whispered. "But it wasn't an accident. They pushed me. My blood ran cold. Who pushed you? I asked. The others, Louisa whispered. The children. They didn't want me here. They were jealous. I didn't understand. What children? I asked. The children who died on the island before me, Louisa whispered. Their spirits are trapped here too. They used the dolls to hurt me. A wave of horror washed over me. I realized then what was happening. The dolls weren't just vessels for Louisa's spirit. They were vessels for the spirits of all the children who had died on the island. And they were using the dolls to torment Louisa, to keep her trapped there. What can I do? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. How can I help you? You have to break the dolls, Louisa whispered. You have to free us all. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. The beautiful, innocent dolls, the objects of my initial fear and disgust, were vessels of suffering, prisons for trapped souls. Louisa's plea echoed in my mind. You have to break the dolls. You have to free us all. It was a daunting task. There were hundreds, maybe thousands, of dolls scattered across the island. But I knew I had to try. I looked at the doll in my hand, the one that had belonged to Louisa. Her photograph lay beside it, a stark reminder of the life that had been stolen from her. I felt a surge of determination, a burning need to right the wrong that had been done. I'll do it, I whispered, my voice hoarse. I'll break every single one of them. Louisa's whisper was barely audible, but I heard it. Thank you, she said. I carefully placed Louisa's doll back in the box and closed the lid. I knew I couldn't destroy her doll. Not yet. It felt like a betrayal. I needed to understand more, to find a way to free her spirit without causing her further pain. I left the shack, stepping back out into the storm. The rain had subsided somewhat, but the wind was still howling, carrying the whispers of the trapped children. The lightning flashed intermittently, illuminating the island in brief, eerie bursts. I started with the dolls closest to the shack. I picked them up one by one, their cold, lifeless eyes staring at me. Some were easy to break, their fragile bodies snapping with a sharp crack. Others were more resistant, their limbs twisted and contorted. It was a slow, laborious process. As I broke each doll, I felt a strange sensation, a release, a sense of lightness. It was as if a weight was being lifted from the island, a dark cloud dissipating. With each broken doll, the whispers seemed to grow fainter, the oppressive atmosphere less intense. But the task was far from over. The dolls were everywhere, clinging to trees, perched on rooftops, scattered across the beach. I knew I would be working through the night, maybe even longer. As I continued my grim task, I started to notice patterns. Some of the dolls were grouped together, as if they were trying to stay close to each other. Others were hidden away, tucked into corners or buried beneath piles of debris. It was as if the children's spirits were trying to protect themselves, to hide from whatever had harmed them. I also noticed that some of the dolls were different from the others. They were older, more worn, their features more grotesque. These dolls seemed to emanate a stronger sense of malice, a darker energy. I felt a chill run down my spine whenever I came across one of them. As the night wore on, I started to feel exhausted. My muscles ached. My hands were raw and bleeding, but I couldn't stop. I knew that the longer the dolls remained intact, the longer Louisa and the other children would be trapped. I thought about Louisa, about the photograph of the smiling girl. I imagined her fear, her pain, her desperate longing for freedom. And I knew that I couldn't give up. I had to keep going, for her sake, for the sake of all the trapped children. As the first rays of dawn began to peek over the horizon, I reached the beach. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a scene of devastation. The beach was littered with debris, and the air was thick with the smell of salt and decay. I continued to break the dolls, one by one. As I worked, I noticed something strange in the distance. A small figure standing on the beach, near the water's edge. It was a child, a young girl. She was wearing a white dress, and her long, dark hair flowed in the wind. My heart skipped a beat. It was Louisa. I rushed towards her, my voice trembling. "Louisa?" I called out. The girl turned to face me. Her eyes were bright and clear, filled with a sense of peace that I hadn't seen before. She smiled at me, a gentle, grateful smile. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft and melodious. "You've set us free." I looked around at the beach. The dolls were gone. All of them. The island felt different, lighter, as if a great burden had been lifted. "What about you?" I asked Louisa. "Are you free too?" Louisa nodded. "Yes," she said. "I'm free now. Thank you for helping us." She turned and looked out at the sea, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Then, she turned back to me, her smile even brighter than before. "It's time for me to go," she said, "but I'll never forget you." And then, she was gone. She simply vanished, like a wisp of smoke carried away by the wind. I stood there for a long moment, watching the waves crash against the shore. The island was silent now, save for the sound of the sea. The whispers were gone. The dolls were gone. Louisa was gone. I had done it. I had broken the curse of Isla de las Muñecas. I had freed the trapped spirits. I turned and walked away from the beach, towards my wrecked boat. I knew I would never forget what had happened on the island. I knew that I had seen something that was beyond human understanding, but I also knew that I had done the right thing. I had helped to heal a deep wound, to bring peace to tormented souls, and that was enough. "50 Berkeley Square." The cab rattled to a halt outside number 50 Berkeley Square, its worn leather seats groaning a protest against the London chill. A thick fog, the kind that clings to the city like a shroud, swirled around the grand, yet decaying, facade. Number 50 wasn't just any address. It was a whisper, a legend, a stain on the polished veneer of Mayfair. It was, quite simply, infamous. I, Dr. Alastair Finch, a man of science and logic, stood before it, a shiver crawling up my spine despite my best efforts at rationalization. I was a psychologist, specializing in anomalous psychology, a field that danced on the edge of the explainable. I had heard the stories, of course. Who hadn't? The chilling tales of 50 Berkeley Square, the most haunted house in London, a place where a nameless, terrifying entity was said to reside on the top floor, a creature that preyed on the sanity of those foolish enough to venture into its domain. My interest wasn't in confirming the ghost stories. I was a scientist, not a ghost hunter. My focus was on the psychological impact of the house, the power of suggestion, the influence of fear and expectation on the human mind. I believed the haunting was rooted in something more tangible, something that could be understood, perhaps even explained. Or so I told myself. I had secured permission from the current, rather reluctant, owner, a descendant of the house's original inhabitants, a man named Mr. Eldridge, to spend a night within its walls. Eldridge, a nervous, pale man with perpetually trembling hands, had practically begged me not to go through with it. He spoke of family curses, of terrible things that had happened within the house, of a darkness that clung to its very bricks. His pleas, rather than deterring me, only fueled my curiosity. I paid the cab driver, a burly man who refused to even look at the house, and approached the heavy oak door. It was a formidable thing, studded with iron and warped with age. I pulled the heavy knocker, a grotesque gargoyle's head, and let it fall. The sound echoed through the silent square, a jarring clang that seemed to hang in the fog. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit hallway. A thin, elderly woman with a face like crumpled parchment stood before me. She introduced herself as Mrs. Perkins, the housekeeper, a woman who looked as though she had been living in the shadows of the house for centuries. Her eyes, though, were sharp and intelligent, and I suspected she knew more about the house than she let on. "Dr. Finch, I presume," she said, her voice a low rasp. "Mr. Eldridge informed me you would be coming. He asked me to ensure you had everything you needed." "Thank you, Mrs. Perkins," I replied. offering a polite smile. "I appreciate your assistance." She led me into the house, the silence broken only by the soft click of her shoes on the dusty floorboards. The air inside was thick and heavy, laden with the scent of damp and decay. The hallway was long and narrow, lined with portraits of stern-faced individuals in elaborate frames. Their eyes seemed to follow me as I walked, their expressions unreadable. "The top floor, sir?" Mrs. Perkins asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes," I replied. "That's where I'll be staying." A flicker of something, fear, pity, crossed her face. She didn't comment, however, and simply nodded, leading me up the grand staircase. The stairs creaked ominously under our weight, each step a groan of protest from the aged wood. As we ascended, the temperature seemed to drop, the air growing colder and more oppressive. The top floor was shrouded in an almost palpable darkness. The windows, grimy and neglected, offered little light. Dust motes danced in the faint beams that penetrated the gloom, creating an eerie, ethereal atmosphere. Mrs. Perkins showed me to a room at the end of the hallway, a large, sparsely furnished chamber with a four-poster bed draped in heavy, dark fabric. This was Mr. Eldridge's grandfather's room, Mrs. Perkins said, her voice trembling slightly. He hasn't been up here in years." I thanked her, and she quickly excused herself, promising to return in the morning. As she hurried down the stairs, I could almost feel her relief at escaping the oppressive atmosphere of the top floor. I was alone. The silence in the room was unnerving. It was a silence that seemed to press in on me, a silence that whispered secrets in the corners of my mind. I unpacked my equipment, a digital recorder, a thermometer, an EMF meter, and a small, high-powered torch. I wanted to document everything, to record any anomalies, any changes in temperature or electromagnetic fields. I began my initial assessment of the room. The EMF meter was surprisingly quiet, showing only normal levels of electromagnetic activity. The temperature was a few degrees colder than the rest of the house, but nothing significant. So far, there was nothing to suggest anything out of the ordinary. But the atmosphere, that was something else entirely. There was a feeling of unease, a sense of being watched that I couldn't shake off. It was a feeling that prickled the hairs on the back of my neck and made my heart beat a little faster. I tried to dismiss it as the power of suggestion, the influence of the stories I had heard, but a small, nagging voice in the back of my mind whispered that it was something more. As darkness fell and the fog outside thickened, the house seemed to come alive. The creaks and groans of the old building grew louder, more insistent. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and sending shivers through the ancient structure. I sat in the dimly lit room, my recorder running, my senses on high alert. I was waiting, listening, watching. For what, I wasn't sure. But I knew, with a growing certainty, that something was going to happen. The first sign was subtle, almost imperceptible. A shift in the air, a sudden drop in temperature that sent a fresh wave of chills down my spine. The thermometer confirmed it. The temperature had fallen another degree, and a thin layer of condensation was forming on the inside of the window pane. It was as if an unseen hand had turned down the thermostat. I checked the EMF meter again. Still quiet. No spikes, no fluctuations, nothing to explain the sudden temperature change. My logical mind struggled to find a rational explanation, but the feeling of unease was growing, tightening its grip on my nerves. Then came the whispers. At first, I thought it was my imagination, the wind playing tricks on my ears, but they grew more distinct, faint voices murmuring just at the edge of hearing. I strained to listen, trying to decipher the words, but they were just fragments, snippets of sentences, too low to understand. They seemed to be coming from the hallway outside the room, drifting through the heavy oak door. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself it was just the old house settling, the wind whistling through cracks in the walls. But the whispers, they sounded human. Or at least, they sounded like they had been human. I reached for the torch, its beam cutting through the darkness. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob. What was I afraid of? I was a scientist, a man of reason. There was no such thing as ghosts. But the fear was real, a cold knot in my stomach. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The darkness was even more intense here, the air thick and heavy. I shone the torch down the hallway, the beam dancing across the dusty floorboards and the faded wallpaper. There was nothing there. Hello? I called out, my voice trembling slightly despite my efforts to remain calm. Silence. Only the sound of my own breathing and the faint creaking of the house. I walked slowly down the hallway, the torch beam illuminating the way. The whispers seemed to have stopped, but the feeling of being watched persisted. I felt eyes on me, unseen observers lurking in the shadows. I reached the end of the hallway and shone the torch into the darkness. There was nothing there, just a blank wall, covered in peeling wallpaper. I turned to go back to the room, but as I did, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A flicker of movement, a shadow moving in the darkness at the far end of the hallway. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I swung the torch back, the beam landing on the spot where I had seen the movement. But there was nothing there. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, my senses on high alert. I was convinced I had seen something, but my logical mind refused to accept it. It must have been my imagination, a trick of the light, the product of an overactive imagination. I went back to the room, closing the door behind me. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hand shaking as I reached for the recorder. I replayed the recording, listening intently for the whispers. But there was nothing, just the sound of my own breathing and the ambient noise of the house. I tried to rationalize what I had seen, to explain it away, but the feeling of unease remained, a cold dread that settled deep in my bones. I lay down on the bed, but sleep eluded me. I tossed and turned, my mind racing, replaying the events of the evening. The whispers, the temperature drop, the shadow, were they real? Or were they just figments of my imagination, the product of the house's reputation and the power of suggestion? As the hours ticked by, the house seemed to grow more restless. The creaks and groans grew louder, more insistent. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and sending shivers through the ancient structure. And the whispers, they returned. This time, they were clearer, more distinct. I could still not understand the words, but there was a distinct change. They were laced with a chilling undercurrent of something malevolent. Suddenly, the temperature in the room plummeted. A wave of icy air washed over me, making my breath catch in my throat. It was as if I had stepped into a freezer. The thermometer confirmed it. The temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. And then, I saw it. A figure, forming in the shadows at the foot of the bed. It was indistinct, a dark shape coalescing in the gloom. It seemed to be tall and thin, with long, spindly limbs. Its face was obscured by shadows, but I could feel its eyes on me, burning into me with an icy intensity. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move, unable to speak. The figure began to move, slowly, deliberately, towards me. It glided across the floor, its movements silent, almost ethereal. As it drew closer, I could feel a wave of coldness emanating from it, a chilling presence that seeped into my bones. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for the inevitable. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the core, that I was in the presence of something truly evil, something that defied explanation, something that was beyond my understanding, something that was not of this world. The figure reached the bed and leaned over me. I could feel its breath on my face, a cold, stale wind that smelled of damp earth and decay. I could feel its presence, a dark, malevolent energy that filled the room. And then, it touched me. A cold, clammy hand grasped my arm, its grip like ice. I gasped, my eyes snapping open. The figure was still there, its face inches from mine. I could see its eyes now, two burning coals in the darkness. They were filled with a hatred, a malevolence that I had never seen before. The figure leaned closer, its breath whispering in my ear. And then it spoke. Its voice was a low, guttural rasp, a sound that seemed to claw at my soul. It spoke a single word, a word that echoed through the room, a word that resonated deep within my being. Mind. The word hung in the air, a chilling pronouncement of ownership. The creature's grip tightened on my arm, its icy touch burning my skin. I tried to pull away, to fight back, but my body refused to obey. I was frozen, trapped in a nightmare that was all too real. The creature's face was closer now, its features slowly becoming visible in the dim light. It was a grotesque parody of a human face, twisted and contorted into an expression of pure malevolence. Its skin was pale and clammy, stretched taut over its skull. Its eyes, those burning coals of hatred, bored into me, stripping away my defenses, exposing my deepest fears. I felt a surge of panic, a desperate need to escape. But the creature's grip was too strong, its presence too overwhelming. I was trapped, helpless, at its mercy. It leaned closer, its breath hot and fetid on my face. I could feel its power, a dark, insidious energy that was seeping into me, corrupting my mind, poisoning my soul. "You are mine now," it whispered again, its voice a rasping growl that seemed to vibrate through my very bones. "You belong to me." I tried to resist, to fight against its influence, but it was no use. The creature's power was too great, its hold on me too strong. I felt my will crumbling, my sanity slipping away. Images flashed through my mind, visions of horror and despair. I saw myself transformed, twisted into a monstrous reflection of the creature before me. I saw my sanity shattered, my mind consumed by darkness. I wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but I couldn't. The creature's power had silenced me, stolen my voice. I was trapped in a silent nightmare, a prisoner in my own body. The creature's grip tightened, its touch burning like fire. I felt a sharp pain in my arm, as if its claws were digging into my flesh. I looked down and saw, with a growing horror, that my skin was turning pale, taking on the same deathly hue as the creature's. I was changing, becoming like it. The creature smiled, a cruel, triumphant grin that revealed its sharp, yellowed teeth. It was enjoying my fear, my despair. It was feeding on my terror, growing stronger with every passing moment. "You cannot escape," it hissed, its voice filled with a chilling glee. "You are mine forever." I felt a surge of defiance, a last desperate flicker of resistance. I would not give in. I would not let it win. I would fight, even if it meant my destruction. I gathered all my strength, all my willpower, and focused it on a single thought: escape. I had to escape, to break free from the creature's grasp. With a sudden, desperate surge of energy, I pushed against the creature, throwing it off balance. It stumbled back, its grip loosening for a moment. I seized the opportunity, scrambling away from the bed, putting as much distance between us as I could. The creature roared in anger, its voice echoing through the room. It lunged at me, its claws outstretched, its eyes burning with fury. I dodged its attack, narrowly avoiding its grasp. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I had to get out of the room, out of the house. I had to escape before it was too late. I ran towards the door, my hand fumbling for the doorknob. I found it, twisted it, and threw the door open. I stumbled out into the hallway, the creature close behind. I could hear its heavy footsteps pounding on the floorboards, its enraged growls echoing through the house. I ran, my feet pounding on the stairs, my lungs burning. I had to reach the ground floor, had to get out of the house. I could hear the creature gaining on me, its footsteps getting closer. I glanced back over my shoulder and saw it, a dark, menacing figure silhouetted against the dim light from the landing. It was almost upon me. I reached the bottom of the stairs and stumbled into the hallway. I could see the front door, a beacon of hope in the darkness. I lunged for it, my hand reaching for the handle. I grasped it, turned it, and threw the door open. I stumbled out into the night, the cold air hitting me like a slap in the face. I gasped for breath, my lungs burning, my heart pounding. I had escaped. For now. I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of my own flat, miles away from Berkeley Square. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and leaned against it, panting, my body trembling. The image of the creature, its burning eyes, its chilling touch, was seared into my mind. I could still feel its icy grip on my arm, the phantom pain a constant reminder of my terrifying encounter. I looked down at my arm. The skin was still slightly paler where the creature had touched me, a faint, chilling mark. It was more than just a mark. It felt like a brand, a symbol of the creature's claim on me. I spent the rest of the night in a state of terrified vigilance, every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside my window, sending shivers down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still out there, somewhere in the darkness, waiting for me. Sleep offered no respite. My dreams were filled with visions of the house, the shadowy figure, its rasping voice echoing through the corridors of my mind. I would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. The next morning, I felt drained, exhausted, as if I hadn't slept at all. The experience at Berkeley Square had shaken me to my core. My carefully constructed world of logic and reason had been shattered, replaced by a chilling uncertainty. I had faced something that defied explanation, something that challenged everything I believed in. I knew I couldn't just ignore what had happened. I was a scientist, a seeker of knowledge. I had to understand what I had encountered, to find some explanation for the terrifying events of the previous night. I started my research, delving into the history of 50 Berkeley Square. I read every account, every legend, every whisper about the house and its dark secrets. I learned about the previous occupants, the strange and tragic events that had befallen them. I discovered that the house had a long and bloody history, a history of madness, death, and unexplained phenomena. The more I learned, the more disturbed I became. The stories were consistent, echoing each other across time. They spoke of a malevolent presence on the top floor, a creature that preyed on the living, driving them to insanity and despair. Some accounts even described the creature, its shadowy form, its burning eyes, its icy touch. The descriptions matched what I had seen, what I had felt. I also discovered that many people who had spent time in the house, particularly on the top floor, had experienced lasting psychological effects. They suffered from nightmares, anxiety, depression, and even psychosis. Some had even taken their own lives. The weight of these discoveries pressed down on me. I realized that what I had experienced was not an isolated incident. I was part of a long and terrifying history, a history that stretched back centuries. I tried to find a rational explanation for the phenomena, to reconcile what I had seen with my scientific understanding of the world. I considered the possibility of mass hysteria, the power of suggestion, the influence of fear and expectation. But none of these explanations seemed to fully account for what I had experienced. The creature, its presence, its touch, it had been real. I knew it in my heart. I decided to return to Berkeley Square. I knew it was dangerous, that I was risking my sanity, perhaps even my life. But I had to go back. I had to face the creature again, to understand its nature, to find a way to break its hold on me. I contacted Mr. Eldridge again, the reluctant owner of the house. He was even more hesitant than before, his voice trembling as he spoke to me on the phone. He begged me not to go back, to forget about the house, to move on with my life. But I was determined. I told him that I had to go back, that it was a matter of life and death. He finally relented, but his voice was filled with dread. A few days later, I found myself standing once again before the imposing facade of 50 Berkeley Square. The fog was back, clinging to the house like a shroud. The air was heavy, oppressive, filled with a sense of foreboding. I took a deep breath and walked towards the door. I knew that I was walking into the heart of darkness, into the lair of a creature that defied explanation. But I also knew that I had to face it, to confront my fears, to reclaim my sanity. I was ready, or at least I thought I was. Some mysteries remain unsolved. Some whispers in the dark will never have an explanation. But one thing is certain: fear is real, and it thrives in the unknown. If you enjoyed this journey into the eerie and unexplained, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Let me know in the comments which story haunted you the most. Until next time, keep your doors locked and never ignore the things that go bump in the night.